to the disaster aid. They're not saying no to the fundamental things that the federal government funds. So there's also a fair bit of hypocrisy that runs rampant, not just in the Republican side, but the Democratic side as well.
Hey, Wendy, let's switch gears a little bit and focus on Israel. It was quite the past 2 or 3 days for President Biden. The administration, Secretary of Defense Blinken is in Israel as we speak. How do you kind of view the Biden administration response so far?
Well, there's the national security element, of course, anti-terrorism, and I think many people have equated the sentiment in Israel to the one that we experienced after 9/11, sort of the shock, the destruction, the loss of life. But there's also a tremendous amount of loss of life now in Gaza, militarily people, but also Hamas, but also civilians, many civilians. This is a really difficult time for the Democratic Party politically, because the very left wing of the Democratic Party, as we saw in New York last week, has been very vocal in their support for Palestine. And not as willing to criticize Hamas sometimes as other people. This is very delicate for the Democrats, who need every single vote possible a year from now. And how do you actually proceed with strong support for Israel if Israel continues to defend itself, but the casualties civilian-wise in Gaza increase? That becomes a problem for the Democrats. And, that's a very hard balance for the president. The sentiment in America is generally pro-Israel to defend itself against the terrorist attack. How long that lasts depends on how much involvement Biden approves in terms of the United States. No boots on the ground. I think there's no support for that in America. But what do you do? How do you give military support but stay within the boundaries? Biden has a lot of experience. And one thing Americans might want to think about is when you are electing the next president, how much experience do they have dealing with these kinds of crises versus having no experience with them? I think that's going to affect our presidential considerations as well.
I wonder if they can tie aid for Ukraine to aid to Israel, because a lot, I'm sure, of these, especially right-wing Republicans who don't want to help Ukraine defend itself against a Russian invasion, definitely do want to help Israel. Do you think they tie those things together, or is it insulting to do that?
No, I mean, you mean the Democrats putting those two things together?
Yeah.
I think strategically, fighting against incursion and invasion might be a theme. And certainly Russia has been accused of atrocities, and Ukrainian soldiers have also been accused of atrocities. So I think it gets very tricky to do that, but it also limits the capacity for Republicans to be isolationists now, right? You can't say, we don't want to get involved, but we want to help Israel. That's just really hard to do, and independent voters in districts won't really put up with that, I don't think. So it puts the Republicans in a tough bind to say yes to Israel but no to Ukraine. And I think you're right, but I think to actively tie it together in a package has risks for the Democrats as well. But the pressure is on the Republicans to decide whether they want to sort of say no to being involved in anything, but then get credit for supporting a response against Hamas. So I think it puts pressure. And since there is no leader, really, of the Republican Party in the House right now, the spokesperson's Mitch McConnell on the Senate side, and we know that he's been having health difficulties.
But he has experience, Wendy.
He does have experience.
You're a fan of experience. Mitch has it.
Mitch has it, but there's a fair number of other Republicans in the Senate right now that do. And it's interesting to me how we, 1 year it's the Senate's fault. They're filibustering. Ted Cruz is shutting everything down. They're horrible. Let's get rid of the filibuster. Let's make it more like the House. And then the House falls apart. And we look to the Senate and say, oh, can't they save the day? So I think we have a crisis of leadership on all sides, more so right now in the Republican Party than the Democrats.
All right, Wendy, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate getting your thoughts there. Wendy Schiller, she's a professor at Brown University, talking about all things political. Boy, it's not just domestic politics, but it's obviously now blended in with geopolitics as well, with Ukraine and Israel, the current hotspots. This is Bloomberg. All right, let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Birkenstock is falling down about 3% right now after a rough first day on the market. Now, it had one of the worst debuts for an IPO of more than $1 billion. Bloomberg's Isabel Lee has more on who acquired the company.
L Catterton, a private equity firm, agreed to buy Birkenstock. We had details last week, but now we have even more. So L Catterton beat out rival CVC Partners, which was supposed to seal the deal earlier this year. The Birkenstock family preferred L Catterton for two reasons. Number one is their track record and their background in bringing to public family-backed consumer brands, and number two, their ability to expand in Asia.
Now, shares may have gone down after the company went public, but the two heirs of the German sandal maker, they're not worried. Bloomberg reports they are now worth a combined $3.4 billion. The boom in weight loss drugs may have food companies on edge, but clothing retailers and sportswear brands could benefit. Deutsche Bank analysts say slimmer people will likely need to buy smaller sizes, and they'll be more motivated to exercise to keep the weight off. They say companies like Adidas, Puma, and H&M could benefit from that. And Walmart is clarifying its comments that the weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy are affecting its bottom line. The retailer tells Morgan Stanley analysts that the small group of customers taking the drugs are spending slightly less on food year over year, but their overall spend is higher. It's coming from categories like lifestyle, fitness, and medications to relieve the side effects of those drugs. Right now, Walmart shares, they're up just a fraction. We have Novo Nordisk up about 2%. Eli Lilly is up about 1%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's start off with swap contracts linked to the future Fed rate decisions, pushing the odds of another quarter-point hike back to about 50%. The expectations for the first rate hike is shifting toward July from the June meeting in next year. Now, this all comes after a measure of household costs rose at a pretty brisk pace in September. You had core consumer prices increasing 0.3%, so that matched August's read. Treasury yields surging as a result. The 10-year yield 9 basis points higher. That's at 4.65. The 2-year is 9 basis points higher. That's over 5%, 5.08%. At the same time, the major stock averages, they are mixed to little change in the S&P 500, the best-performing industry group that belongs to information technology. NASDAQ 100 up 79 points. That's up 0.5%. The S&P 500 up just 1 point right now, 43.78 on the index. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 69 points. And we check the markets for you all day long. Right here on Bloomberg Radio, I'm John Tucker. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
All right, JT, thanks
John
very
Tucker,
much.
thank you so much. We
both appreciate
We're
it.
broadcasting live from Commonwealth's 2023 National Financial Advisors Conference at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado. All right, Matt, what do you got for us?
Well, we have Hassam Naji here in the studio, I'm pleased to say.
Nice.
He's the president and CEO of Marcus and Millichap, and we're going to talk a little bit of real estate with him in the face of, rates that just continue to rise. Paul the other day was quoting, I think, the bank rate 30-year mortgage out to 8%. Which has got to put real pressure on a market where affordability is already off the charts. What does this mean for real estate?
First of all, thanks for having me on. Great to be back with you. The answer to that question, Matt, is a severe disruption in trading activity, in investors' ability to value real estate, and a lot of uncertainty out there. On the housing front, we're seeing anyone who has a low interest rate already decline to bring inventory to market or stay put, which is really reducing sales velocity there. As a buyer, the affordability has gone so out of control that people are renting apartments longer. They're staying in their apartments much longer than anticipated, and the renewal rates of apartments are actually showing really good rent growth. On the commercial side, it's not just the price dislocation, it's the fact that banks have pulled out of the market by pricing themselves out of the market, and other lenders have not been able to step in to make up for what banks normally do in financing commercial real estate. So there's a real logjam in the marketplace as we speak.
So on the housing side, on the residential side, there's just not any pre-owned houses trading hands, right? On the commercial real estate side, what you're saying is people can't get refinancing that they need, and so what? Are they forced to sell?
Well, the refinancing issue in and of itself is a serious one because the loans that are maturing today were issued 5 to 7 years ago. Thankfully, a lot of equity has been built up. A lot of rent growth has been basically achieved. So not every maturing loan is in trouble, but there is a pretty good chunk of the maturing loans, especially in office, not really so much any other property type, that is having to either be sold as distressed or having to get a workout between the lender and the borrower. The Treasury and the Fed have really pushed lenders to work with the borrowers to avoid a fire sale, if you will. So we're not expecting a huge wave of fire sale in even in the office sector, but you're already starting to see some distressed sales in older office product. Newer office product is actually performing better than most people realize.
All right, Hassam, I am a huge bear when it comes to commercial real estate, and particularly the office space. I just think we have a doom loop kind of building here, where, the values of these real estates are nowhere near enough to support their debt, and it's going to become really apparent when we see some transactions cross the market and reset the market. So I'm wondering, have we seen anything in like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA? Like, I haven't really seen any big property in New York trade. And when it does trade, I'm afraid it's going to be at 30, 40, 50% discount. How are you thinking about that?
It really depends on the asset. Some of the assets that are going to trade will fall in the exact description that you're sharing right now. Older office product has vacancy rates in the 20 to 25% or higher. Newer office product on average, meaning the land built in the last 15 years or earlier, is half that, about 11%. So there is a huge dichotomy. And the obsolescence of older office buildings, unlike obsolescence of shopping centers where you could knock down a shopping center or an old warehouse that is obsolete and have a reuse or reimagination, it's much harder to do that with older office product. So the reuse is one rescue channel. Another is just a pure discounting of the asset to what the fair market value would be. Believe it or not, there is a lot of entrepreneurial buyers of that product. We're actually helping a number of them either go directly to the lenders or wait for product to come to market. But the cycle will be pretty ugly for that older office stock that you're describing, Paul.
Yeah, what's going to happen to, Bloomberg Business Week did a cool piece last year about the 3rd Avenue corridor, which has a lot of that office space, with the problem that you're talking about. It's just unconvertible. There's no way to make it into apartments, and nobody wants to use it as office space. What happens? Do we just have a ton of storage space buildings all the way down 3rd Avenue and in the middle of Manhattan, some of the most expensive real estate in the world?
Here's what I predict. I predict opportunistic buyers will come and buy it, as Paul was saying, 30, 40 cents on the dollar. They'll upgrade it do a value add, and wait for the return to office to improve. It's never going to go back to pre-pandemic, but I also think we've come off the lows of people's resistance to come back into the office. Urban America is not dead forever. It's hit really hard right now, but those opportunistic investors, because of the basis points they're going to basically come in on acquiring those assets, or the price point versus replacement cost, have a much longer kind of a viewpoint on it and a time horizon than a 2 or 3 year hold.
So there's just a repricing then of assets. What's your view then, and this gets big, this is like 35,000 feet, but what's your view on the cities of America?
Well, urban America is taking it on the chin, no question about it, whether it's Chicago or San Francisco or Seattle or anywhere else. Now, if you look at Miami, if you look at even the comeback we were seeing in somewhere like Seattle versus San Francisco, Chicago, or New York, you can see that the comeback can be affected in those other markets. It's just going to take a lot of time. New York, adding 100,000 jobs in the last 12 months, is actually much better off than other urban areas because we are creating those jobs and a lot of young people want to live here.
Yeah, that's pretty. Well, we haven't got the congestion charge yet, so just wait for that.
Right.
Then John Tucker's going to be staying home and doing all of his broadcasting from the shore.
But Matt, one thing to add is there's such a judge the book by the cover. Everyone's talking about commercial real estate as though the whole industry is older office buildings. And older office buildings are an important segment, but office, as I pointed out last time I was on the air with you guys, makes up 15% of the total outstanding commercial loans. And if you look at the entire commercial real estate industry, it makes up 24% of the total bank loans outstanding. So it's a much smaller percentage of risk than people realize. And we're concerned that this perception of older office is going to affect financing for self-storage units or shopping centers even, or apartments that are doing much better.
So I was going to ask then, looking at the whole pie of commercial real estate, and office space, as you're pointing out, is just a fairly small piece. What are the parts of the pie that you like?
Well, 50% of the outstanding commercial loans held by banks is in multifamily. 95% occupancies. Rent growth has flattened out after jumping almost 30% in the last 3 years, so it's taking a little bit of a breather. And within multifamily, we have a lot of assets that were financed on short-term financing with debt funds in the last 3 years that are already coming due. They're having some problems refining as well, but nothing like the office market.
But do you see opportunity there then? I mean, in multifamily, if you get a good deal, a low valuation, do you go and snap it up?
Absolutely. For any property that on an equal to equal basis is coming to market 15, 20% below peak pricing as of March of 2022, we have multiple bids, multiple offers for those assets.
All right, fascinating stuff, Hassam. Thanks so much for coming in. Always appreciate you stopping by. Hassam Naji is the president and CEO of Marcus & Millichap. And we do, Paul, tend to default to office. When we're talking about CRE loans, that's our focus. And as Hassam points out, that's just not right. I mean, it's not even close to the majority of the loans held by banks.
Yeah, and as Hassam made another interesting point, which I didn't think of before, which is, commercial real estate is such a huge asset class, and there are so many smart, creative people out there that they're going to get creative about what to do with this real estate and what to do with the capital structure supporting some of these properties. And I think we're not going to. I don't think we're going to have a corridor like 3rd Avenue from Grand Central all the way up to Bloomberg that's going to be empty. They're going to figure out something to do with these properties.
Yeah, well, I just wonder what it'll be. I mean, you've got to maybe blow a hole through the middle of the building so you can put windows in all the apartments if you want to do it like that, or you've got to do a lot of self-storage.
I don't know, and I just think, if you're adding jobs, are they all remote jobs? I don't know. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But we have a front row seat for it right there in Midtown Manhattan. Markets here, pretty much unchanged on the S&P 500. The Dow's off about 0.25%. The Nasdaq's up about 0.1%. So we got that inflation print today, kind of in line with, maybe slightly higher than expectations. But it kind of goes to the issue that this Fed is probably going to stay right here. Maybe one more, but we'll see. But right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Amy Marr, she's got world and national news for us.
All right, thank you, Paul. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met in Tel Aviv, where Netanyahu thanked the U.S. for its unwavering support and compared Hamas to ISIS.
And just as ISIS was crushed, so too will Hamas be crushed. And Hamas should be treated exactly the way ISIS was treated. They should be spit out from the community of nations.
Secretary Blinken warned adversaries thinking of taking advantage of the current situation and reaffirmed that the U.S. has Israel's back. This as Israel fired missiles at Syria's airports at Damascus and Aleppo, putting both of them out of service. The United Auto Workers shutting down Ford's largest factory in Kentucky. That strike is ongoing. The union announced the surprise walkout by 8,700 workers in a post on social media last night. UAW President Shawn Fain says Ford gave them the same offer from 2 weeks ago and says they felt they needed to escalate their efforts so they can be paid more.
It's frustrating. Really, we have been at the table every day. The vice presidents, the bargaining committees have been working so hard to bring an equitable and fair agreement to the membership.
Ford says the addition of the Kentucky truck plant will impact 100,000 people after 9,000 employees stopped their work. And another strike to tell you about. Strike talks have broken off between Hollywood actors and the studios. The Alliance of Studios and Streaming Services that negotiates with actors said that late last night, the two sides were so far apart in their contract talks that there's no point in continuing. The union has been on strike since July. Writers, as you know, return to work, but actors will remain out of production indefinitely. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker, the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. We have red and green on the screen. Yields, let's start there. They are surging today. The 2-year yield, 9 basis points higher, 5.07%. The 10-year up just about 10 basis points, 465 on the benchmark. The key inflation report showing prices climbing higher than expected. The Consumer Price Index report for September showed inflation came in at 0.4%. So again, that's pushed the Treasury yields higher today. As far as the major stock averages, they're mixed right now. In fact, it seems counterintuitive, but the tech-dominated NASDAQ on track for the 5th straight day in a winning streak. Meantime, Michael Scholl at Marketfield Asset Management watching the markets, and he is not optimistic about the future.
You know, I'm of the view that the Fed doesn't really have things under control. It's certainly not in control of the fiscal policy of this country. The fiscal policy of this country is reckless in the extreme.
In fact, he sees the Fed initiating yield curve control at some point. S&P 500 right now 2 points lower at 43.74 in the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down 88 points, and the NASDAQ 100 right now 52 points higher. That is up 0.3%. And good news for Manhattan renters. The rental market softening in September. Prices falling from their summer peak. Down, the median rent on new leases down 1.1%. You want to take a guess what the monthly rent is?
$4,000.
$4,350. That's down. That's like 3 times my
That's
mortgage.
for what? For a 1-bedroom?
That's for a closet with a toilet, is my guess. Anyway, that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. We're broadcasting live from Commonwealth's 2023 National Financial Advisors Conference. We're here at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado. Joined next by Shelby Trickino. She's a certified financial planner at Independent Wealth Management. She joins me here at the conference here in Colorado. Shelby, so we'll talk about the markets and stuff like that, but what I find interesting about your background, you've been into business a long time. But you lead an all-woman team of financial advisors. Now, I do see in the mix here a lot of women here. But tell me, what's the percentage of women in kind of like in your line of the business, financial advisory business?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Good morning. Right now, the statistics are still under 20% women financial advisors in our industry. We haven't grown the way we'd like to have grown, certainly in the last 10 years. So we're working on that.
So I guess the issue here is, for a lot of folks, is when we get people into these financial services, I've had a lot of experience in recruiting. At the entry level, you get a lot of diversity because it's easy to go onto a campus or something and find a diverse incoming class. But then 4, 5, 6, 7 years later, when it's time for the promotion for leadership positions, it's not so diverse anymore. Do you find that in your experience as well?
Yes, we do, and we're trying to change that. I'm not sure we know exactly why that is. Certainly there's some extra pressure to, run a financial planning practice, investment firm, along with everything else you want to do personally. So.
Yep. All right, so let's get to your business here. Talk to us about just what you're telling your clients these days about these markets. Last year was a tough year, whether you're in equities or you're in fixed income. This year's a little bit better, certainly on the equity side if you're in the right names, I guess. Well, what are you telling your clients these days?
Yeah, this has been historic. I celebrate 40 years in the business next year, and I think that 22, having the combination of the stock and the bond market in negative territory, the average balance fund down 16 to 18%. It tested the best of the best. We do our best to assess where a risk temperament is with our clients and run through the respective, tests on that. But this past year, we found out where the risk temperament really was. So we're telling them, it's time, we got to take a deep breath with this. We're huge proponents of having emergency cash set aside so that we can actually allocate a portfolio of quality investment holdings to see them through on their short-term, medium-term, long-term goals. But this has been such a balancing act between the technicalities of this market and the emotional wherewithal. So it's been a heavy lift.
So do you still, how do you diversify a portfolio now, or how do you protect against correlations?
Yeah, that has been an interesting challenge. Obviously last year, where we've historically relied on the bond market to stabilize the portfolio and create that income stream, we couldn't go there. And so there was heavier cash positions. We look out in every sector of the market to determine, that risk reward temperament. And it's been, a combination. So there's some, solid dividend paying stocks in there. We've got some commodity exposure. We've tried to keep it simple. I, historically have used some of the more advanced instruments and not always been rewarded for the extra expense we pay internally.
Well, I mean, you could go, I've been telling people after 2022 where there's no place to hide, equities down double digits, even most fixed income classes down double digits, which had never happened before. I can sit here at a 2-year treasury at 5.07%. Even my 27-year-old daughter called me up and says, I'm going to go put some money into a high yield savings account from Marcus. So she's already playing the markets, and she's in the music business. So I can sit there in some of these relatively secure places and get a decent return.
Yeah, so you know what? And Marcus has been a solid place for short-term money and emergency funds. That's an easy call. So for maybe short-term emergency funds, great. But we got, it's time to dip your toe in.
Yep.
And I think keeping perspective in this environment is the most important thing. And with all the noise that we've got going on out there, that's really hard to do.
All right, so what are so if I wanted to come to you, if I came to you and I said, I have 60-40 portfolio, sounds reasonable to me. What stocks would you look at, or what sectors would you look at, or how would you think about that if I said, I've got my 5 and 10 year horizon?
Yeah, Paul, I think it's actually, we love growth. this AI, it's real, but I think at the end of the day, you have to be balanced. The heavy, we've relied on the large cap space for the bulk of the returns, and I think it's time to make sure you've got the mid cap and the small cap exposure for the next wave. We look at that 100-year chart of this market. We've been through really difficult times before. We're going to get through this. You got to be positioned to be able to take advantage of it.
You guys, and I'm sure everybody in Colorado is in fantastic shape, but the rest of America needs a little help. You mentioned AI, and it makes me think of what I've come to dub AI Junior, and that's the GLP-1 drugs. What do you think about that? Is it really like a strategy-changing development, or is it just fun for us to talk about in a few stocks?
No, you know what? From the sounds of it and everything I've read, it sounds like it is a real thing. And I think, the innovation that we're seeing in the healthcare space and also in the automotive industry is pretty mind-bending. So, used properly, I think AI could be enormously impactful.
Hey, Shelby, thank you so much for joining us. Shelby Trincano, certified financial planner, or independent wealth management, independent wealth strategies, joining us here at the conference in Aurora, Colorado. We're here at the Commonwealth 2023 National Financial Advisors Conference. We're at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado. Looking at these markets right here, kind of just not much direction here. A little bit of mixed. The S&P only off about 0.1%. The Dow off about 0.3%. Yeah, we're getting a little bit of a lift here for NASDAQ, up 0.1%. So we'll look at that. Looking at the dollar index, dollar stronger today. Euro, sterling weaker today against the U.S. dollar. WTI crude oil, it's now down a little bit. Now just about $83.38. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Hey there, Paul. Walgreens has unveiled plans to cut costs by at least $1 billion and lower capital expenditures by about $600 million. This as the company gets ready to welcome its new CEO. More from Bloomberg's Simone Foxman.
The company was looking for a successor with that healthcare experience. Tim Wentworth was the former CEO of Express Scripts, which you may remember was acquired by Cigna back in 2018. But the challenge for Walgreens has always been, will this turn towards healthcare that we saw indeed under the former CEO, Roz Brewer, actually pay off? Will Executive Chairman Stefano Pessina actually go along with this, since he has a very retail background?
Wentworth will take the lead October 23rd. Walgreens shares right now, they're up about 4.5%. Former Barclays boss Jess Staley has been fined $2.2 million and banned from working in the UK finance industry. The country's Financial Conduct Authority has found he recklessly misled investors and the bank about his relationship with the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Bloomberg's Tom Metcalf is in London and says there's more to come.
Staley is appealing this, so this was effectively the first appeal to this probe, and then now it's going to something called the upper tribunal, where again you'll have some independent people look at the findings, look at the investigation, look at what Staley is saying, and make a call there. But in terms of the implications as of today, everything will need to wait until that sort of final appeal comes through.
The bank is also pushing for Staley to forfeit some of his awards, including his bonus for 2021. Barclays shares down about 3%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney, live with you, Bloomberg Radio. Looking at these markets here, again, kind of very quiet out there. Really no change on the S&P. The Dow's only off about 0.2%. A little bit of a move higher in the NASDAQ. The real movement here is in the yield space. We've got yields higher here, both the 2-year and the 10-year, up by 9 to 10 basis points. The 10-year is now trading at 4.65%. That's the yield on your 10-year. Your 2-year yield is 5.07%. And again, the dollar is stronger. The Bloomberg Dollar Index is up almost 0.5% here. Crude oil steady, $83.64 per barrel. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Amy Marsh has got World International News for us.
All right, thank you, Paul. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel pledging American support as Israeli forces pound Gaza with airstrikes. More from Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern in Washington.
What you heard from Secretary Blinken today was really a follow-on of the emphatic support we heard from Biden, his last 2 speeches, talking about the cruelty and how barbaric this was of Hamas and the massacre that occurred over the weekend. He also says how Israel does this matters. And he says we democracies need to make sure we hold ourselves to those standards.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reporting more than 2,200 people have been killed since the latest war with Hamas began. Republicans picked Representative Steve Scalise as their nominee to become House Speaker. Opposition from a group of hardliners threatens to delay a final vote and leave the chamber without a leader. Bloomberg's Bill Ferries was on Bloomberg Daybreak.
He was the pick over Jim Jordan, and Jim Jordan came out and said, even talked about publicly nominating Scalise for the role on the floor of the House. That was still not enough to win over some Republican colleagues saying Scalise is not our guy. We're not going to vote for him.
Bloomberg's Bill Ferries. House Republicans are scheduled to meet at 12:30 this afternoon, about a half hour from now. It's happening this weekend, what astronomers are calling the Ring of Fire eclipse.
Flames went higher, and it burns, burns, burns. The ring of fire.
This Ring of Fire eclipse giving grid operators their largest controlled experiment for dealing with big swings in renewable power. The skies will darken October 14th, and the eclipse will knock out as much as 28,000 gigawatts of solar generation. And nobody expects power shortages. Many are bolstering their backup supply just in case, but this is going to give operators more insight into what resources they will need ahead of next year's solar eclipse, which is supposed to be even bigger. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Matt.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt, I flagged this story here, the big take story. You know how we like the big take stories. But airlines, they are racing to hunt down fake parts in their fleets. A little-known distributor in London sold thousands of engine components with bogus documentation. Carriers and repair shops are frantically hunting them down. And this is across a whole swath of the air fleet here, and it's really got folks in the aviation industry a little bit concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, a little-known distributor. There have been now 90 certificates that have been falsified, according to Safran and GE, which put together motors together. Bogus parts have been found on 126 engines, and all are linked to AOG Technics. That's the distributor, AOG Technics. An outfit started 8 years ago by a young entrepreneur named Jose Alejandro Zamora Irala. So engineers are trained to spot components of dubious origin, fortunately, and they have been doing that, but they say it's always shocking when they find a fake part or a bogus certificate on a worn part, and it has to make you worry a little bit.
It does, but hopefully they can get that down. Hey, Matt, I read a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal. U.S. Qatar agreed to stop Iran from tapping $6 billion fund. That's according to the Washington Post. So it seems like some sanctions are in order from the West, and this may be, one of the first ones. So we'll have to go get further reporting on this going forward as well. But the U.S. and Qatar agreed to stop Iran from tapping $6 billion fund. That's according to the Washington Post. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
We got a lot of green on the screen here, but the volume is light.
We constantly underestimate the strength of the U.S. consumer.
This is a market that's much more optimistic or bullish than maybe the central bankers are.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
There's still some concern out there in the market that there is room for things to deteriorate a little bit more than what they're indicating.
As small and medium-sized businesses struggle, they don't present as much competition.
The supply chain has still got dislocations globally and here in the U.S.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, we are broadcasting live from Commonwealth's 2023 National Financial Advisors Conference at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado. Coming up in this hour, we're going to check in with Ethan Bronner. He's an Israeli bureau chief for Bloomberg News, and joins from Tel Aviv to give us the latest news on the conflict. And then Jeffrey Cleveland, chief economist at Payton & Regal. He's going to join to break down the inflation data and the outlook for a soft landing. But first, let's go to Charlie Pella, get a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you very much, Paul and Matt. We do have stocks trading mixed right now. 4-point gain in the S&P 500 index, back in the green at 43.81, up right now by about 0.1%. The Dow lower by 21 points, a decline now of 0.1%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is up 39 points, higher by about 0.3%. Treasury yields climbed, stocks fluctuated as the latest reading on consumer prices bolstered speculation that the Federal Reserve is nowhere near done declaring victory over inflation, with bets on another rate hike back to coin flip territory. We've got the 10-year at 4.65%, the 2-year 5.07%. Again, the S&P little changed, up by about 0.1%. A retreat today for Bitcoin, now at 26,680, down by about 0.1%. Spot gold, little change, lower as well, down 0.1%, 1873 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%, 83.87 for a barrel of WTI. What about the Federal Reserve? Following this morning's CPI report, Vance Barse is a wealth strategist at Your Dedicated Fiduciary, YDF, and he was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Markets at the Commonwealth Conference in Aurora, Colorado.
Given the interest rate environment, we think we're pretty close to the Fed largely being done. That creates an opportunity for getting back into specific types of duration, whether it's individual issues or some bond funds or even potentially ETFs. Regardless, we're going to be long duration here in the next 3 to 6 months, depending on how it plays out.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Day 2 of trading for Birkenstock, down another 4.5%. Ford, meanwhile, has become the latest strike target for the United Auto Workers Union after members walked out of its largest plant, a highly profitable pickup factory in Louisville, Kentucky. Ford shares, they're down 1.8%. Rival GM down 1.7%. Stellantis lower by 1.7% as well. Recapping, stocks are trading mixed. S&P up 1 point, little change there. 10-year 4.64%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie, thanks very much. Charlie Pellet there with your Bloomberg Business Flash. I just want to quickly go back over that headline, Paul, that you broke minutes ago. The U.S. and Qatar, at least according to the Washington Post, are going to agree to stop Iran from tapping the $6 billion fund that they just unfroze for Iran weeks ago in a prisoner swap. So it's important to point out that this $6 billion fund is money that Iran had from the sale of its oil supplies, and then the U.S. had frozen. Now, we unfroze it in order to get some prisoners back, but this is money that really was intended only for humanitarian aid. So for feeding the hungry, really, and for housing the homeless. And the U.S. was going to have to agree to each transaction. But now, of course, the backlash after the horrifying attacks of Hamas in Iran have pushed senators and the administration towards refreezing that money. And the concern, I think, Paul, is that this would maybe embolden hardline voices in Iran even more than they already are, especially as they're now talking with, sworn enemy Saudi Arabia on the phone in friendly chit-chats.
Yep, exactly right. Matt, let's bring in Ethan Bronner. He's a bureau chief in Israel for Bloomberg News. Hey, Ethan, just a fluid situation. We'd appreciate if you could just give us the latest reporting on what is happening on the ground in Israel and kind of what the coming days, I guess.
Sure. So today was a fairly important day in the sense that Antony Blinken came here, the U.S. Secretary of State, and met with the leaders here, with Netanyahu and so forth. And the main message he brought was one of very personal pain as a Jew and as an official of the United States. And the United States has embraced the Israeli view that Hamas is the new ISIS and that it needs to be crushed, which is an entirely new approach to Hamas. This is for the last 16 years. The Israelis have had a kind of tolerant relationship with Hamas, thinking that it's better than chaos in Gaza, and now they seem to want to destroy it entirely and send someone else in to take over, and it's a little unclear who that would be. But before that, we're expecting a ground operation in the coming days.
I wonder, Ethan, about the rescue operation, the corridor from Gaza that the Egyptians are, I guess, ready and willing to open up, or it is open, but there's too much shelling from Israel. What's the story there?
The story there is that the Egyptians have mixed feelings themselves. I mean, this is, of course, let's begin with the Palestinians in Gaza have suffered an enormous number of sorties by Israeli jet fighters. There are 1,300 or 1,400 people dead in Gaza. So and they don't have any place to go. It's not an easy place to hide. So there's that. Now, the Egyptians do not want a massive influx of Palestinians into their territory themselves, but there is talk of a corridor. The Israelis, in theory, don't want to kill civilians, but they are worried about a humanitarian corridor being an escape route for the Hamas leaders that they are seeking to kill. So it's not going very well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that if you let the good guys out in a flood, then the bad guys can go with them. What's the likelihood that we see a ground invasion into Gaza? Because we've been talking about the massive troops there on the border. Well, I should better ask, Ethan, when do you think we're going to see a ground invasion of Gaza?
Well, look, I don't know exactly, but I know that the calculation involves the following factors. One, the troops are gathered and ready to go. There is an incredible fury in the national psyche, and there's a sense that the United States and many other allies are willing to let this happen soon. The sooner, the better from that point of view. On the other hand, they are, as they say, softening up the targets on the ground. There is no doubt that Hamas is expecting them and has set traps for them. And so the more they can destroy on the way from the air, that will reduce their own casualties once they go into the ground, the better. So I think it's the balance between those two forces. And it should be said that the military spokesman this morning in a briefing said that the new emergency government has not actually authorized a ground invasion yet. But I have to tell you that all analysts and all officials expect it to happen. I mean, I'd say one more thing, which is I should say one more thing about a ground invasion, which is that it doesn't have to be a kind of the entire strip is covered with ground troops. It could be that they get word of where, say, a high important Hamas leader is, and they send in a brigade to go after that guy. It could be something like that. It doesn't. So it will involve ground troops, but it doesn't have to mean a full reoccupation. I'm sorry.
No, that's clear. We appreciate that, Ethan. So just lastly here, there's going to be collateral damage. How much is Israel willing to inflict in terms of the civilian population, in terms of casualties? Because, as I think Mr. Blinken said, the world is watching.
Yes. Look, I think that the Israelis are in a state of complete shock about what happened on Saturday. The more bodies they uncover that were treated cruelly by these guys who came in, the angrier they are, and so forth. So I think that they are. They're not trying to harm civilians, but they are willing to, if necessary, and they're also willing to, I believe, lose their own hostages that are being held there.
Ethan, the attacks by Hamas were unquestionably horrific, but I wonder how much of of an issue fake news is here. I heard the President of the United States in a speech yesterday at the White House say, and I'll quote directly, "I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children." Now that, when I heard that, I winced because, you know, we'd seen a lot of reports, but nothing was confirmed. But when you have the president of the of America and the leader of the free world saying he's confirmed it, you know, it adds a lot of validity to that statement. Now, later, the White House says the president did not confirm those photos. He did not see them firsthand, and the White House did not independently confirm their authenticity.
That's right.
How much of
yeah. Look, I mean, these are good questions, and we're asking the same ones ourselves. I would say that the defense minister of Israel told NATO ambassadors today about beheaded children. The prime minister of this country has spoken of them. I have not seen such photographs. I am not sure, but I will say that if they're making it up, it's a very shocking thing. So there has unquestionably been a level of cruelty. Entire families were burned, were shot dead, and the stories that the survivors tell are horrific. So whether there are certain details that have been exaggerated or made up, I agree with you. We need to be sure. I don't know the answer. But responsible officials are talking about those utterly, unbelievably cruel acts.
Right. All right, Ethan, thank you so much for your reporting. Ethan Bronner, Israel Bureau Chief with Bloomberg News from Tel Aviv, giving us the latest reporting here. We had some economic data this morning, some more inflation data. I think it probably came in line with or maybe just a little bit hotter than expected, but I think all sides can probably claim some type of victory here. Jeffrey Cleveland joins us. He's a chief economist at Payden and Regal. So, Jeffrey, we had some PPI this week, some consumer price index today. What did you take away from some of the inflation data we got today, and maybe how it might influence our Federal Reserve?
Well, I'll tell you what, yesterday I had a new dishwasher installed, the price of which was a bit shocking. So I'm still an inflation hawk here, I think. And the data, you know, the data confirms it. You look at, I like to look at median CPI. We've definitely talked about this before, but you look month to month change in median CPI. Looked like it slowed down a little bit in the summer. We had a 0.2% reading, and then we had a 0.3% reading. And then the latest month that we got today, median CPI was 0.5 month to month. And the reason I like median CPI is I think it's a good gauge of underlying inflation pressures. It doesn't play the game of, you know, let's exclude this, let's exclude that because people don't like the different categories. It's just excluding the outliers. So I like it. It's a good, clean read. I think everyone should use it. But it tells you that inflation accelerated in the last couple of months. And I think that is consistent with our view that we've been espousing, which is that inflation is still an issue that the average person is dealing with. And it's too soon for the Fed to declare victory on the inflation front yet.
Nonetheless, the market has already done that for the Fed, right? I mean, the chances of a rate hike, I haven't checked in the last few minutes, but let's see. WIRP.
There's like 3 basis points, I think, priced in for November.
So what's that all about? This market has fought the Fed for a year and a half or longer and continues to do so.
The problem is in the last 4 or 5 days, as you both know, we've had a lot of Fed speakers. They've all they seem to be on a same page, which is we've done a lot. Things are moving in the right direction, and financial conditions have tightened, and that's doing some of our work for us. So like the move up in the 10-year yield that we've seen is part of financial conditions. The strength of the dollar is part of financial conditions. The weakness in equity prices in the last month or so, part of financial conditions tightening. So that was the mantra that they were kind of selling. I think the problem with that is then we get a inflation report like this morning, where I do think the underlying inflation trend has picked up a little bit here. So I think the market should keep the possibility of another hike on the table. So, but we'll have to see how things play out over the next couple of days.
Exactly. So that's in terms of inflation. I think, you know, a lot of folks can see what they want to see in there, but it certainly, you know, has come down, and the Fed has some things to feel pretty good about there. But the concern here about recession and just the overall economy, how do you think about that as we kind of think about the early part of 24?
Well, to me, the data is not at all pointing to a recession. we've had data accelerate here in Q3. So whether we're talking about estimates of GDP or consumer spending, looks like to us it's accelerated in Q3. I'm a big fan of just looking at non-farm payrolls. Again, through June, you could argue that payrolls were slowing. The June reading, 105,000, might end up being the low for the year. And the last 3 months, we've had an acceleration in non-farm payroll. So definitely not consistent with the recession. Don't see one on the near-term horizon. Maybe that's something we could talk about in the second half of next year. But right now, the U.S. economy appears to have a pretty solid momentum here.
Even with the consumer, I mean, you know, if this consumer is so healthy, I wouldn't expect so much in terms of purchases to go on credit cards. I wouldn't expect delinquencies to climb so much. For auto loans, I guess I would, because I know the prices people are paying are unsustainable in terms of the monthly hit. Plus, you've got the student loans coming back online, and you've had long-term interest rates rise considerably. How can you not worry about this consumer?
Income growth. I think income growth is the two-word answer to that. You still, when you look at the jobs report, you add up all the people working, how many hours they're working, what they're being paid, you're still seeing 5 to 6% year-on-year nominal income growth. And that, for me, is the most important thing. That will help the aggregate consumer. Yes, delinquencies have ticked up on things like credit cards, but if you look at that chart, we've ticked back up to where we were pre-COVID. So we're still very low on a historical basis, but it's really that income growth story. Once income growth starts to crater, the last 3 or 4 cycles, that's when you should get more concerned about consumer spending. We're just not there yet. Doesn't mean we won't be there at some point next year, but right now, that's not the key story, in my view.
All right, Jeffrey, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Appreciate getting some of your time. Jeffrey Cleveland, he's a director and chief economist at Payton & Regal. And Matt, I think that's why, you know, this earnings season coming up is going to be important, as most of them typically are. But you really want to get a sense of how that consumer is doing out there.
Yes. Well, and as you know, because I say it all the time, I'm really looking at margins to see, okay, inflation increased a little bit, re-accelerated a little bit, but it's been coming down. And I wonder what kind of effect that will have on margins, because companies are given less of an excuse to raise prices.
Yeah, exactly. And that's certainly something that Gina Martin Adams of Bloomberg Intelligence has been talking to us about for a long time. Focus on profit margins. S&P 500 absolutely unched on the day, maybe up a tenth, not much there. Dow, same. NASDAQ up 0.25%. Yields are higher, though. We've got the 10-year Treasury, 4.64%, so we're going to keep an eye on that. More coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Delta is trimming its 2023 profit outlook due to a higher fuel price and also maintenance costs. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle says investors aren't too concerned.
So what they like is the idea that demand for the holiday season appears to be pretty solid. In fact, over the last 6 days, this stock now up 5 days. Now, relative to the trimming of the range, their adjusted earnings will now be $6 to $6.25. The street's at $6.03, so the bottom end still hugs that number, and it's the high end that's come in, so really upside. Revenue is expected to grow by 30%.
Now, shares right now up just a fraction. And IKEA is cutting its prices as the higher cost of living squeezes consumers. Discounts will be made across a range of products, including a 20% cut on the popular Billy bookshelf. Now, the furniture company had hiked prices at the beginning of the year due to soaring costs on its supply chain. And Sony is looking to attract more gamers this holiday with a new console. The company has unveiled a slimmer, lighter PlayStation 5 with a detachable disc drive. It'll cost $500 with the disc drive and about $50 less without it. They go on sale next month. Sony shares right now up about 1.5%. And a treat for Swifties. Taylor Swift's AMC. Yes, Taylor Swift's AMC Theaters takeover is happening sooner than expected. The Eras Tour concert film, it was originally scheduled to open tomorrow, but the singer announced on social media that it will begin showing in the U.S. and Canada today. Variety reports the movie expected to bring in as much as $175 million. Globally, AMC right now up about 2%. I'm Lisa Mateo.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We are looking at a U.S. stock market that right now is little changed, with a 0.2% gain for the S&P 500 index, up 8 points at 4385. We've got the Dow up 0.1%, higher by 25 points, but the Nasdaq Composite Index now up 0.4%, higher by 49 points. The 10-year yield, 4.64%, with a 2-year, 5.07%. Spot gold lower by $1.50 to $18.72 the ounce, down by about 0.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, 83.57 for a barrel of WTI. A measure of household costs rose at a brisk pace in September. Core consumer prices increased 0.3%, matching August. The data also show wages are no longer keeping up with inflation. Reaction to this morning's report from Jeffrey Cleveland, who's chief economist at Payden and Regal, and he was a guest moments ago right here on Bloomberg Markets.
I do think the underlying inflation trend has picked up a little bit here. So I think the market should keep the possibility of another hike on the table.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. The day after their mega deal was announced, ExxonMobil and Pioneer Natural are both trading higher again today. ExxonMobil up by 0.8%, Pioneer Natural up by 1.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. We're broadcasting live from Commonwealth's 2023 National Financial Advisors Conference at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado. I want to bring in Peter Essel. He is the Senior Vice President of Investment Management and Research at Commonwealth. And Peter, I spent a long part of my career in equity and investment research. Tell me how you guys do it at Commonwealth.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So our role is in support of roughly 2,500 independent advisors, where we cover everything from individual equities to mutual fund research to credit analysis on the fixed income side. And what we've seen as of late is that there's been a strong interest in creating model-based solutions. So we've really partnered with a lot of our advisors, acting more so as like an outsourced CIO capacity, where we support them in their model construction efforts, monitoring, and so forth. In addition to that, there are a number of advisors who have elected to outsource investment management to us, and so we directly advise over $12 billion in assets, and then advise on another about $150 billion or so.
Wow. Okay. So, what's a typical, what's a typical ask from an RIA from you guys, from your organization? Is it to say, hey, should I buy Apple, or is this AI thing for real? What kind of requests do you typically get?
Absolutely. Honestly, it's anything under the sun at this point. Okay. Everything from AI stocks to the latest and greatest, to going back a few years ago, looking at cannabis stocks. And what we've seen recently is a lot of advisors looking for a red flag analysis. So that is everything from taking a deep dive into a client's prospective portfolio that comes over, looking at structured products, individual equities like you talked about, in addition to just general outlook and commentary around the direction of the economy. So obviously, with inflationary concerns persisting pretty heavily as of late, they want our views on interest rates and what that outlook looks like, and how that should be reflected in their portfolio positioning related to duration and so forth. So honestly, it runs the gamut from individual security analysis all the way out to views on the markets and the economy.
So what's a red flag? I mean, is that like, if I think 2 years ago, weed stocks are definitely screaming buy because I see that, revenues are picking up in the states where they're legal, and I feel like it's time to get in. But you come back and say, well, they're not federally legal yet, and they can't do any banking. So this would be a very bad idea.
It can come in that form. It generally involves a look into security as it relates to a client's investment risk tolerance. So, for instance, if there's a high concentration in distressed debt for an 80-year-old investor who has very little assets and has a conservatively positioned risk tolerance, that would be a major red flag for us, obviously. But there are instances where, yes, on a security-specific basis, where you have sort of these thematic plays that are very binary in nature, where they can either soar to the clouds or basically turn out into pennies, that would be a red flag for us as well. But generally, it relates to the client's risk tolerance.
So what are you telling your clients these days about, I don't know, just kind of, do you have like a market call here that you guys are pretty constructive on the equity markets or not? So how do you kind of frame it out for them?
Yeah, generally we try to deploy a 12 to 24 month outlook, and we often try to sift through the noise. And a perfect example of that would be March of 2020, where obviously there was a lot going on. Markets were down. I believe the S&P was down over 30% in the course of a month. And that's an environment where we tend to get a little bit more optimistic and like to add risk into our portfolios. And we did so in fact, it was on March 23rd, 2020, where we added equity exposure, roughly 800 basis points for a 60-40 portfolio. So we like to look for those opportunities of volatility when investors are rushing for their exits. We're generally rushing in. But as far as our outlook at this point, there's clearly a lot going on the geopolitical side of things. Again, we like to look through that noise and deploy that 12 to 24 month outlook. And we are still optimistic heading into this year. There were a lot of economists out on the street saying that this was the year of the recession. This was probably the most anticipated recession in my career. And we sort of took the opposite of view to that, where we saw more of the Goldilocks economy scenario, which thankfully has played out year to date. And we're somewhat concerned at this point because it seems like a majority of those economists have now shifted more in line with what our outlook is, where we continue to see modest wage growth. We do believe inflation is going to reach the Fed's mandate by Q4 of 2024. And as such, we don't think that there's going to be a significant rise on the long end of the curve. And we're mentioning to our clients and advisors that they think that they should think about redeploying some of that cash that they'd stockpiled
Peter,
over the past 6 to 12 months.
Does the spending of the U.S. government not concern you? I mean, we, post-COVID are still running $1 trillion plus deficits every year. And, we've already amassed such a huge debt. It's towering over our GDP. That's the kind of thing that would make me as an investor want to join the bond vigilantes and drive those long-term rates up.
Right. I hear what you're saying. I mean, certainly next year the politicians will be throwing stones ahead of the election, and there's going to be some volatility as it relates to the fiscal deficit. But still, at the end of the day, I mean, the U.S. Treasury is the benchmark yield, the benchmark asset around the world. So even if there are concerns over our fiscal issues, there's going to be a significant amount of demand from foreign governments, from large pension plans that will help keep yields at a reasonable level.
What are you saying about the fixed income space? Again, I'm kind of a scaredy cat after what happened in 2022, where there's no place left to hide equities or fixed income. And I feel like, boy, if I can get 5% for giving my money to Uncle Sam for a couple of years, that's not a bad thing.
That's absolutely how we're looking at it. So if you can get 4.75 on a 10-year Treasury locked in and clip that coupon over the next 10 years, we feel that's a much more attractive option than placing all your assets into a cash-like exposure that perhaps is giving you a little bit more. You're getting 5.25. But will that be 5.25 for the next decade? We don't necessarily think so. So that's why we've been advising our advisors to think about inching out in duration and locking in some of those higher yields for the next 10 years.
How much do you use ETFs? Or how much do your RIAs use ETFs? Because When I came into the business, there weren't any ETFs. It was mutual funds.
Right.
Now the ETFs are taking all the market share.
Yep, they certainly are. I believe asset-wise, it's split 50-50 at this point, with maybe just a little bit more in ETFs. We are seeing them, and we've seen a lot of core satellite-type portfolios, which the core, the base, is allocated to either index mutual funds or ETFs, and then advisors are rounding out that exposure with higher active share, higher concentration, active mutual fund managers. But certainly over the next few years, with the evolution of ETFs into the active space, we're really going to become product agnostic, where if there's a viable solution on the ETF side, if it's active, we can allocate to that. We'll take a look at active mutual funds, passive ETFs, et cetera.
Alternatives. Do your clients ask you about alternatives?
We do get
private
questions.
equity or private credit or other kind of stuff?
Oh, absolutely, both on the private and the liquid side. And the way we generally approach alternatives is that it's when we get asked, well, should I allocate to alternatives? It's kind of like saying, well, I'm hungry, I should eat food, right? There's many different types of alternatives out there, as you mentioned, private equity, private credit. There's managed futures, et cetera. So it really comes down to the type of exposure that you're looking for, the type of factor you're looking for in a portfolio. But certainly for higher net worth clients, we are seeing a greater interest as of late on the private credit side of things.
And that's where all the money's going, it seems like, private
Right.
credit. All right, Peter, thanks so much for joining us. Peter Essel, he's our Senior VP of Investment Management and Research at Commonwealth. Looking at these markets, just a little bit of a lift here, a little bit of green on the screen here. S&P up about 0.2%. The NASDAQ up about almost 0.4%. So a little bit of a lift there on the back of that inflation print from earlier. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get rolled in national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. The House is still without a leader, although GOP lawmakers are meeting behind closed doors right now. They do have a nominee, Steve Scalise, but while he did top his opponent, Jim Jordan, in another closed-door meeting late yesterday, he does not appear to have the votes to be elected by the full chamber. Israel's continuing its campaign to crush Hamas in the sixth day of their war. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says it's time to stand tall against evil.
Hamas has shown itself to be an enemy of civilization. The massacring of young people in an outdoor music festival, the butchering of entire families, the murder of parents in front of their children, and the murder of children in front of their parents.
Netanyahu spoke alongside Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who just arrived in Israel. Blinken says Israel has America's full support.
We must stand together, resolved to confront what is worst among humanity with what is best.
Blinken says the U.S. is supplying ammunition, interceptors to replenish Israel's Iron Dome, as well as other defense material. Congress is working to add to that emergency aid, and Republican Senator John Cornyn wants any Israeli package to also include aid to Ukraine.
This is part of the responsibility, I believe, we as Americans bear for living in the most prosperous, strongest country in the world.
Cornyn's views, though, are not supported by some hardline House Republicans. U.S. officials and the Qatari government have reportedly agreed to stop Iran from accessing a $6 billion account for humanitarian needs. The Washington Post reports it's due to Iran's possible involvement in the Hamas attacks. And U.S. Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey faces a new criminal charge of conspiring to act as an unregistered foreign agent of Egypt. This is in a revised indictment returned today. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are in the green. Treasury yields are climbing. Stocks, though, have been fluctuating as the latest reading on consumer prices bolstered speculation that the Fed is nowhere near declaring victory over inflation, with bets on another rate increase back to coin flip territory. So here's where we stand. S&P up 8 points right now at 43.84. That is a gain of 0.2%. The Dow little changed, up 9 points, while NASDAQ, the composite index, up 48 points, higher by about 0.4%. 10-year yield, 4.65%. The 2-year right now, 5.06%. Spot gold down $1.50 the ounce to $18.74. Little change there, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 0.2%, 83.31 a barrel on WTI. Consumer prices did advance at a brisk pace for a second month, reinforcing the Fed's intent to keep interest rates high and bring down inflation. Reaction to the inflation data this morning from Bill Booth, who is co-CIO at Epic Investment Partners, and he was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
One of the interesting things that people tend to forget about with the inflation data is cumulative inflation versus year-on-year inflation. So even though inflation is moderating to 4%, this is coming on some big increases over the last 24 months. And so cumulatively over the last couple of years, consumers have really seen their spending on everyday necessities balloon.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. Delta's reporting quarterly earnings that beat estimates, but the carrier cut the high end of its outlook for 2023 profit on rising fuel prices and larger than expected aircraft maintenance costs. Delta up today by 0.9%. Day two for Birkenstock. The stock is down another 4.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pella, thank you so much. We appreciate that. We are broadcasting live from Commonwealth's 2023 National Financial Advisors Conference at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado. Like he is wont to do, Matt has left us, abandoned us as he makes over to the TV studio for his TV duties here today. But not to worry, we got Jess Metton. She's our equities reporter for Bloomberg News and a frequent contributor to Bloomberg Markets program. She's joining us for the next few minutes. Jess, how are you? Thank you.
Thanks for having me, as always. You know, I thought it was interesting. I was looking at some of the size and scope since it is Thursday heading into Friday. And when you look at where the S&P 500 is this week, up over 1.5%. It's actually up. We would be on pace for its best week since September 1st, that week that ended there. And then obviously before that, the last 1% up week was the July 28th. So that was when around the time the S&P 500 actually peaked out there, Paul.
Yeah, interesting. So we'll keep an eye on that. Ryan Bellinger joins us. He is a managing principal at Claro Advisors. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us here. You know, it's been, September, October is a tough time for markets historically, just looking at the calendar. What are you telling your clients these days about kind of how far they should go out on the risk profile, or should they do what I'm doing, just sitting in 2-year treasuries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of different conversations we're having, but for the most part, it's been keep your equities on the lighter side of what your target allocation would be. So if you're a client that would typically own somewhere between 50 and 75% of their portfolio in equities, you might be closer to 50%, maybe 60%, and keep it high quality. I think your reference to how much interest cash is paying these days in the 2-year treasuries, that it's a lot of competition for the stock market, competition we haven't seen in a lot of years. So I think investors have kind of woken up to that. Unfortunately, if you've owned bonds in the portfolio, you expect those to be a ballast, but those have just been walloped in the last 18 months. So I think at this point, most people can say whether we get no more rate hikes, 1 more rate hike, 2 more hikes, the majority of that work has been done. And so from a fixed income perspective, I think you should be pretty comfortable owning, bonds at this level, and you should make a nice return going forward.
Paul brought up seasonality. I wanted to point out today is October 12th, so that means 1 year ago today, the S&P 500, that was where it actually bottomed. If you look at that since then, the S&P 500 is up about 22%. What's your view on where the market has come since then and where you think potentially, especially because of the fourth quarter, typically October obviously has a bad reputation, but usually it's coming off of the back of the two worst months of the years, and October has been known to be that bear killer.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, look, 80% of economists this time last year predicted a recession for now. You know, they thought that we'd see 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And as it turns out, it's probably going to be one of the best years in the last 10 for growth, you know, in the top quartile probably. So, you know, most people were wrong. And that's just how investing goes. You just have to, you know, have a plan of action and kind of stick to that and be disciplined. And where investors can do well is if they move their asset allocation, you know, within ranges, but they don't try to time the market. And so that's what we advocate. I think looking forward from an earnings perspective, you know, it wasn't just, it was in July where we thought earnings would be, you know, negative for this quarter. It turns out they're going to be positive. So again, forecasters were wrong. And I predict they'll be wrong again this quarter. They're looking for almost 10 to 11% for Q4 earnings. And I think that's just going to be really challenging. You've got probably 25 million people that have to start paying student loan debt back. And I don't know how much longer these consumers are going to be willing to absorb the price increases.
I wanted to actually follow up on that
right,
because with the price increases, this is something Paul and I have talked a lot about because of the concerns and lingering concerns about a recession. But what do you really think? Because I know student loan resumption starting this month, but what do you really think it's going to take to, because when you're looking at particularly travel, I know domestically hasn't been as strong as international, but it seems like, especially ahead of the holiday seasons, people are still willing to pay up for prices here when they're traveling.
Yeah, I mean, I think people probably were much better off than we thought during those couple of years when people were getting paid not to work. And so that cash is running low. We'll have to just keep an eye on the credit card companies and their reporting and how far into credit people are willing to go. At some point, it'll stop. I mean, at some point, you have to make a decision whether, you know, to buy that new expensive appliance or a car, or to, you know, save the money, keep it in the bank. Maybe you're uncertain about your job. And, you know, these things just take time to play out. They don't tend to happen as quickly as people would forecast. So I still think that's all coming. You know, I don't think we're going to get out of this without a recession.
So when you're looking at stocks here, how important are dividends for you, given where we are in kind of the cycle, the economic cycle, and given the, you know, the interest rate backdrop? How do you think about dividends when you're looking at equities?
They're critical. I mean, really, especially in these times, you want companies that are returning cash to shareholders in many different forms. But dividends are great, especially if, you know, they're, you know, if you have a favorable tax position, they're really nice. We're looking for companies that are, you know, under-levered right now. I think the companies that loaded up on a lot of debt, especially if it was floating, that's all going to be refinanced this year, next year, the year after that. And so interest costs are going to balloon at a lot of these companies. So we want companies that have really strong cash flows, of course, but also balance sheets. We want companies that termed out their debt, you know, over long time horizons, or have little to no debt. That would be even better. I think those companies will perform very well.
We only have about a minute left here, but your thoughts heading into Friday, especially with a lot of these big banks reporting on tap, especially JP Morgan, Citi, Wells Fargo. We'll also have some regional banks soon too, in addition to BlackRock as well. So PNC, what do you want to hear from these banks, and what in particular are you looking for?
Well, deposits for sure. I mean, you know, I thought we'd see more stress in the banking system after the SVB situation and Credit Suisse. That hasn't played out. Now, if you remember back in 2008, you know, it was like March and then again in September, October, where more stress came out. So again, these things kind of can take some time. But I want to hear the bank's views on their own deposits. You know, we've seen a lot of clients moving, you know, large amounts of money out of their banks because the banks just still aren't paying competitive rates. Yep. You mentioned 2-year treasuries, you know, over 5%. A lot of money markets can be that too. So I want to hear about deposits, and then if consumers are spending.
All right, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Ryan Bellinger, he's a managing principal at Claro Advisors, getting his thoughts on these markets. Markets a smidge higher here today, this morning. We're going to have more. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. A highly profitable Ford pickup factory in Kentucky has become the latest strike target for the United Auto Workers. Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld has more on what went wrong.
Ford last week had proposed a 23% raise, which Sean Fain said last Friday was the top offer that they had received. But Ford wouldn't raise that offer any higher at a 5 p.m. meeting yesterday, which of course led the UAW to announce that walkout just hours later. Now, Ford has called the union's decision, quote, grossly irresponsible and warned of painful aftershocks for both suppliers and customers.
Now, that Kentucky plant generates about $25 billion a year in revenue. Ford shares right now down about 1.5%. To Hollywood, where talks are said to have broken down between striking actors and the studios. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti has that story.
SAG-AFTRA said industry CEOs walked away after refusing to counter the latest union offer. A group representing the studios said the union's current offer would cost more than $800 million a year and create an untenable economic burden.
The Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, it says their contract offer to the actors is just as good as the deal that recently ended a writer strike. We'll check in with shares of Disney right now. They're down about 0.5%. And job cuts could be coming to Netflix as the company restructures its animation unit. Now, Variety reports that changes will also shut down 2 films currently in pre-production. It says the streamer is looking to recruit outside producers to keep its animated content volume consistent. Netflix shares right now down just a fraction. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets here on this Thursday afternoon, really mixed out there. The S&P's up just fractionally up about 0.1%. The Dow's hunched on the day, and we've got the Nasdaq up about 0.3%. Look at the yield space; definitely has some movement there. We've got the 10-year up 11 basis points here, and we have the 10-year now yielding 4.67%. So some movement there in the rates. The 2-year, I'm still getting 4.07 on a 2-year, and on the looking at WTI oil, off about 0.5%, $83, right on $83 here. So continuing to pull back a little bit off of that early week surge we saw on Monday. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is making the rounds in Israel, is expanding his travel schedule and will go to Doha later this week to discuss Hamas with Qatari leaders. Qatar is seen as a possible intermediary in discussions about hostages being held by Hamas. And it's also overseeing the release of $6 billion in Iranian funds. The Washington Post is reporting the U.S. and Qatar have agreed to stop Iran from accessing that money. Secretary Blinken says so far none of it has been released.
We have strict oversight of the funds, and we retain the right to freeze them.
Blinken says he'll also be visiting Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. The death toll is now up to more than 2,600 in the war between Israel and Hamas. 25 Americans are included in that count. Plus, there are more people missing and many believed to be hostages. The International Committee of the Red Cross says it's been in touch with Hamas and Israeli authorities as it works to secure their release. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has been meeting with his NATO counterparts today in Brussels and taking questions about U.S. aid to Israel and Ukraine.
In the light of concerns about civilian casualties inevitable in an invasion of Gaza, Austin was asked if there were any restrictions attached to supplying U.S. weapons.
We've not placed any conditions on the provision of this equipment. This is a professional military led by professional leadership, and we would hope and expect that they would do the right things in the prosecution of their campaign.
Asked if U.S. intelligence detected that Hamas invasion of Israel was coming, Austin said it did not. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
We're still waiting to learn when House Republicans will take a floor vote on Speaker of the House. Majority Leader Steve Scalise is the nominee, but there are questions over whether he'll be able to garner the votes needed to win the job. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Paul and Jess.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Metton sitting in for Matt Miller. Paul Sweeney here. I am in Colorado. I am in Aurora, Colorado, the Commonwealth's 2023 National Financial Advisors Conference at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado. Hey, Jess, I'm looking at a story here. We got a couple of strikes still ongoing, at least. The actors, so think Hollywood, think Los Angeles, and the auto workers, think Detroit. Delta comes out today. Delta Airlines says it's also feeling pain from the strikes that are battering the entertainment and automotive industries, and the impact is probably greater than any other carrier. That's because Delta has hub airports in Los Angeles, the center of the ongoing actor strike, and Detroit, which is a key metropolitan area for automakers. I would not have guessed that before they said that today.
Right, and looking at negotiations between Hollywood studios and then the SAG Actors Union were actually suspended today because of disagreements in key areas. It's still, not surprisingly, including pay. And we've talked a lot about this, Paul, and especially dashing some of those hopes that the months-long dispute will end. So members of the UAW have extended their strike. And we were talking about this earlier too, Paul, with Ford and remaining off the job with some when it comes to GM and Stellantis. But looking at Delta stock, ticker symbol DAL, they're down about 0.1% on the back of obviously that earnings report that we saw earlier this morning.
Yeah, and I was a little surprised, that in the auto side, it seems like the pricing of the increases is rising. I think 23% was the latest offer. And then in Hollywood, I mean, you got the writers' deal done. I kind of thought once you got the writers' deal done, the actors would kind of fall in the line, but neither is working out at the case. So we still have some work stoppages out there that these industries have to deal with. All right, coming up, Sound On with Joe Matthew from Washington, D.C. Guess what? That starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
The Biden administration says we're making good on a long-held promise. Ballooning budget deficits in Washington. We're in a bizarro political world here.
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
Most people, including most Republicans in Congress, understand that we need to get aid to Ukraine.
Who's going to take us in a rational way into the future and lead our country?
This has really become kind of a new frontier in American politics, is this battle between red states and blue cities.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
NATO demands the release of the hostages as Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in Tel Aviv. Welcome to the fastest show in politics on now day 7 of the conflict in Israel. We're joined for the latest on this by Bloomberg national security expert Nick Wadhams, and we'll talk strategy with retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett with us at the table today in Washington. House Republicans back behind closed doors today to try to work on a speaker as Steve Scalise counts votes, but there is no path yet. And Kevin McCarthy is now throwing doubt on the Scalise nomination. We'll talk about all these stories with Republican strategist Lauren Tomlinson, partner at Steer PR, former advisor to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, former spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security. So let's get to it. We start, as always, with a look at Wall Street markets right now with Charlie Pellet in New York.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Unchanged on the day right now for the S&P 500 index has been fluctuating between gains and losses, but right now unchanged. We've got the Dow down 42 points, a decline of 0.1%. The Nasdaq Composite Index is up 24. That is a gain right now of 0.2%. Treasury yields climbed, stocks fluctuated as the latest reading on consumer prices bolstered speculation that the Fed is nowhere near declaring victory over inflation, with bets on another rate increase back to coin flip territory. The 10-year right now at 4.68%, the 2 years yielding 5.07%. Gold down $3 the ounce to $18.71, drop there of 0.2%, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 0.6%, $82.96 a barrel on WTI. Consumer prices advanced at a brisk pace for a second month, reinforcing the Fed's intent to keep rates high and bring down inflation. Reaction to the data this morning from Troy Gayaski, who is Chief Market Strategist at FS Investment Solutions.
Inflation will continue to come down, but the next 6 to 9 months, the question is, with a stronger economy, a still very hot labor market, is there a path to getting it to 2% anytime soon? And it looks more and more like the answer is no.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Among the names reporting earnings this morning, Walgreens Boots Alliance. It announced a $1 billion cost-cutting program. Walgreens Boots Alliance shares are advancing. They're up now by 6.6%. And as we've been reporting, Delta out this morning. Delta shares lower now by 0.5% after earnings. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red right now, just turning lower with the S&P down 8, drop there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Mike Charlie, thank you and welcome to the Thursday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. It is Thursday. I have to think for a second the way time has been passing here and the news flow. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where, of course, there are many questions about our support for Israel without a Speaker of the House, and we're going to get to the Speaker's battle, but let's start with what we know here on day 7. As I look to the terminal, the Israel latest column is being constantly updated, and they're doing a really great job on this. As Secretary of State Antony Blinken touches down in Tel Aviv. We're going to talk about his visit here in just a moment with Nick Wadhams. He's already expanded the trip, though, with the headline, Blinken expanding the trip to Saudi Arabia and Egypt. He spoke a short time ago upon his arrival in Tel Aviv.
I'm here quite simply with one message, and that is the United States stands with Israel today, tomorrow, every day. I think it's almost impossible for any of us to comprehend on a human level what Israel's experienced at the hands of Hamas.
He was speaking there extemporaneously after meeting with a group of survivors of the Hamas attacks last weekend. He later held a formal news conference. In fact, it may still be underway. in which he was asked about the strike carrier group, the Gerald Ford, that's heading in that direction, and other potential U.S. military involvement. Here's what he said.
We are, of course, as you know, providing assistance as requested by Israel for its efforts. That will continue, and we're working closely with Congress to make sure that Israel has what it needs to do what it must. With regard to the second front, as I mentioned earlier, it's our determination and that of Israel as well that there not be a second front or a third front.
If you're watching us on YouTube, where you can find us by searching Bloomberg Global News, you're seeing video as well of Blinken, who held a joint news conference with Benjamin Netanyahu earlier. Let's bring in Nick Wadhams, Bloomberg National Security Team Leader. He's our expert on this story and turning a lot of content here out of the Bloomberg Bureau in Washington. It's good to see you, Nick. Thank you for joining. The significance of this visit, maybe you can speak to Antony Blinken acting almost presidential as he touches down, speaking from the heart, having an emotional meeting with the survivors, and now this news conference. He seems to be the tip of the spear here for the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the roles that the top U.S. diplomat often plays before there's even any real agenda for him. It's like, get on the plane, go over there, show that the U.S. has your back. And that's certainly what he wanted to do here. The big question I have is, when does this ground war start, and what happens if Secretary Blinken's in the region, and then what happens to the extent of U.S. involvement? So you heard him there saying, the U.S. has Israel's back tomorrow, today, and every day. This thing is going to go in a lot of very unpredictable ways, and the U.S. is going to have some tough decisions to make as that happens.
That's for sure. What do you make of the addition of Saudi Arabia and Egypt? To your point, if he's in one of those countries and the ground invasion of Gaza begins, that's going to change the backdrop of this conversation real fast.
That's right. So he's going to 4 more countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And obviously all 4 of those countries have different levels of influence on Hamas and Iran, Qatar, for example. So what he's really trying to show there is that the U.S. wants to prevent this from becoming a wider war. So as bad as it is, if you have further evidence of Iranian involvement in the Hamas attacks, what's Israel going to do to Iran? And so it could get a whole lot worse and a whole lot bigger. Obviously, Egypt has some influence on Hamas, on Hezbollah. We don't know what's going to happen there. So this is a move where he's trying to push these U.S. priorities. Okay, we have Israel's back. We don't want this to spread in a wider war. We also have this desire to keep this normalization program on track, Israel and Saudi Arabia. So while they're telling Israel, you guys go do what you need to do, at the same time they're saying, hey, please don't forget about this peace initiative that we have that we want to keep on track.
So he's spinning a lot of plates on this trip, clearly.
He really is.
He was asked about, speaking of the Iranians, the $6 billion that was part of the recent prisoner swap with Iran. Nick, all of a sudden, the last 2 days, we talked to Republican lawmakers, and this is all we're hearing about is, refreeze the money. And I'm not sure exactly what that would even look like, as this money has not done more than move to an account that's being run by the Qataris. Listen to what Antony Blinken had to say about this in the news conference.
None of the funds that have now gone to Qatar have actually been spent or accessed in any way by Iran. Indeed, funds from that account are overseen by the Treasury Department, can only be dispensed for humanitarian goods, food, medicine, medical equipment, and never touch Iranian hands. We have strict oversight of the funds, and we retain the right to freeze them.
What's going to happen to this money? We retain the right to freeze them. This was part of a deal that was made. Would that agitate the Iranians further?
Yeah, I mean, this one is very complicated and has the possibility of going pear-shaped really quickly because, the U.S. made this deal with Iran. So if they then go back on that, then what's going to be the status of, potential future talks over prisoner swaps? The Iran issue has become so politicized in the U.S., it's sort of hard to see it straight. But safe to say that the one issue that is the case is that the U.S. has been pushing this policy of de-escalation with Iran, of trying to use small steps to lead to other agreements to neutralize their nuclear program. Obviously, if Iran is involved in some way in the attack or in support of Hamas, it would cast a lot of doubt over that policy of de-escalation. But I think it is safe to assume right now that whether or not there is a formal policy of freezing those funds, the U.S., the Treasury Department, Qatar, they are not going to allow that money to move really quickly, even if it's for humanitarian goods in Iran. There is some reporting out there that there has been a formal freeze of those funds. Secretary Blinken did not go that far. There may be a legal issue there whether they can actually do that, but safe to assume that money's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Nick, thanks for coming over. We'd like to stay in touch with you to the extent that you're available. I appreciate it as always. He runs our national security coverage here in the Bloomberg Washington Bureau. Nick Wadhams and his expertise with us today to get things rolling on Bloomberg Sound On. We're going to bring in General Mark Kimmett here next as we also hear from the Secretary of Defense. Lloyd Austin held a news conference a bit earlier today and spoke directly to this potential tie, this involvement in this attack with Iran. Here's the Secretary.
We've not seen any indication that Iran was involved in the planning or the execution of this attack. We've not seen any of those indications yet. And this is something that we remain focused on. And of course, what we know at this point is that there are no indications that was the case. But again, we will remain focused on this.
No indications yet, and there are demands, of course, for them to show some evidence here. The other question that the Secretary knocked down was whether the U.S. had some early warning. We spoke yesterday at this time with Congressman Michael McCall, who discussed the fact that Egypt had given Israel 3 days' notice on intelligence that it had. The Secretary said, don't look here.
In terms of early warning or our indications and warning that we may have had to that this was going to occur, of course, if we had those indications, we would share them with Israel. But to my knowledge, we did not see that. So.
All right. That was Lloyd Austin, for those of you watching us on YouTube. As we turn to the General now, Mark Kimmett is with us, retired Brigadier General, of course, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. It's great to see you, sir. Welcome back to the table, as always. We appear to be here on the threshold of a ground invasion, and we were talking about it on Bloomberg a couple of days ago. These forces are still amassing. What do you make of the walk-up to this apparently inevitable step?
Well, I think the Israelis are doing exactly what you would expect a force to be doing pre-attack. No doubt they have their intelligence assets out. No doubt they're training, they're going over their plans, they're bringing their logistics up. All the normal things you would expect before you cross what we call the line of departure, the line of contact. It's very interesting to note that Gaza is so small that there is not a place once you cross that border where you cannot be shot from. So they need to be completely ready the moment they cross that border.
Wow. I have a lot of questions about the form that this may take. But to what extent do you think Israel is allowing time for hostages to be recovered?
Oh, I have no doubt that there is some subterranean conversation going on between Hamas and Israel. I don't expect much to come from that. Hamas certainly understands that the only thing they have right now that can temper the Israeli attack are those hostages. Once they release those hostages, I would expect Israel to go in a way they have not gone into Gaza before.
We're talking about taking buildings down here.
I think they'll stay completely within the laws of war, humanitarian law, but I don't think they will hold back on either their tactics and techniques.
So how do you do this when you're dealing with an entrenched enemy that has tunnels, to your point, extremely dense urban environment where they know the landscape better than anyone. This is a very difficult mission.
It's extraordinarily difficult, particularly because of the tunnels, particularly because you have hostages, Israeli and American hostages, inside of Gaza. As I said before, that's the great conundrum. The military has been given a task, which is to go in, uproot and eliminate Hamas leadership, bring the hostages back, and try to keep the amount of civilian casualties to a minimum. That is an enormously difficult task, probably the most difficult task you can get a military. If they do too much, the hostages could be killed. If they do too little, the mission may fail.
Are they already there? Are there special forces in Gaza making preparations?
I'm not going to reflect on that, but I would tell you that in the past, for this type of operation, you would need to have very, very good intelligence. Now, given that it appears to me that the Gaza Informer Network that Israeli intelligence has had could have been wiped out before the attack, they're going to need to get ground intelligence, close-up intelligence, and that can't be done from a satellite, can't be done from a radar.
Is this then door-to-door, hand-to-hand combat, or will this be coupled by air-to-ground? What type of a battle are we talking about here, or does it take different contours as it rolls?
I think it takes different contours as it rolls, but again, within the laws of land combat, the norms of armed conflict, I do not believe the Israelis will hold back.
They obviously have resources Hamas does not have. What are the most important ones?
Their troops.
Yeah.
They have disciplined troops that are completely enraged by the atrocities committed. I would not want to be on the wrong side of an Israeli rifle right now.
No, sir. The Gerald Ford is steaming to the eastern Mediterranean. Apparently the Ike is as well. Yeah. Will they take part in command and control, or this is really about projecting power and providing a deterrent?
I think the main mission is to deter other actors from getting involved. That was the clear message from President Biden. However, those aircraft carriers and those strike fleets have tremendous intelligence gathering and tremendous planning capabilities. They're also bringing in special units, no doubt. And if, in fact, somebody decides to cross the line and make this wider conflict, it is a tremendous defensive capability, deterrence capability.
We could see a lot of things take place over the coming days and weeks. Do you have any sense of timeline when they roll in?
And if I did, I wouldn't tell you.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's probably for the best. Mark Kimmett, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
As always. We learn something whenever we have the general with us here on Bloomberg TV, on YouTube, on radio, whatever the platform might be. Retired Brigadier General, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and glad you joined us. We get analysis on everything we've been talking about and turn our attention as well to the battle for Speaker here in Washington with Republican House members behind closed doors today. Lauren Tomlinson, Republican strategist, is up next. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Stocks are now retreating with losses for the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, and the NASDAQ 100 index. A lot of red on the screen right now. S&P is down 23 points, a decline there of 0.5%. The S&P now at 43.52. The Dow lower by 187 points, down by about 0.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 70, a decline there of 0.5%. 10-year yield 4.69%, with the 2-year right now 5.06%. Spot gold down $4 the ounce to $1,870. That is a drop right now of about 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5%, 83.09 a barrel, against spot gold at $18.70 the ounce. Stocks are lower, Treasury yields are climbing, as this morning's reading on consumer prices bolstered speculation that the Fed is nowhere near declaring victory over inflation, with bets on another rate hike back to coin flip territory. Ford has become the latest strike target for the United Auto Workers after members walked out of its largest plant, a highly profitable pickup factory in Louisville, Kentucky. Ford shares, they're down 2.1%. General Motors down 2.2%. And Stellantis shares down by 2.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from Washington as the Secretary of State makes his way to Tel Aviv. Antony Blinken touched down earlier today. He's already met with Benjamin Netanyahu and held a news conference earlier with some additional news on the trip as well. He's adding Saudi Arabia and Egypt to the itinerary here, which could get interesting if a ground invasion begins while he's overseas. Antony Blinken referring to two paths that the Middle East can take.
Countries in this region, and in many ways countries in this world. But here, in the Middle East, there's the path of integration, cooperation, normalization, and equal measures of justice, opportunity, dignity for all peoples, including the Palestinians. Or there's the path that Hamas has shown to the world these last few days. Terror, destruction, nihilism. A path that leads to nowhere for anyone, except to the darkest places in our souls.
The darkest places in our souls. Antony Blinken sounding and speaking somewhat presidential on the visit here, speaking off the cuff in that case, and making a lot of headlines from overseas as he met as well with the survivors of the attacks from last weekend. We'll have more on that coming up here as we bring Lauren Tomlinson into the conversation. You know her as a Republican strategist here on Bloomberg. It's great to see you. Welcome. People should also know not only you're a partner at Steer PR, but you were also in the national security space for a long time as an official at the Department of Homeland Security. You helped to advise the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House. And so we appreciate your perspective. I'd like to get to a couple of things today with you. And we can start with this trip. The Secretary of State seems to really be touching people in an effective way here as sort of the representative of the United States, with the president speaking here yesterday. It's really Antony Blinken showing up in person who seems to be moving people when it comes to our message. What do you make of the trip so far?
I mean, I think the trip is very well timed and needed. And also, you know, Secretary Blinken is Jewish. And so he has a deep connection to, I think, this issue, these people, and it's coming across as very authentic in a way that I think that other officials probably couldn't connect in that way.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think it's very important that he's there. He's sending a very strong message of United States support for Israel, condemning Hamas and these terrible attacks. And, I think right now we have to continue to communicate as often as possible. The Biden administration, in particular, Biden has got to fill any voids of misinformation and make sure that he is out speaking constantly about support for Israel, diplomatic, economic, militarily, whatever we need to do to make sure that we are supporting Israel in a full force way. And they need to be communicating to the world and the American public that this is the stance that America will take. And I think this trip definitely shows that level of support and that deep connection to Israel.
He's adding the UAE and Qatar to the trip, as well as Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And a lot of talk about the Qataris lately with this money that is being held in an account. $6 billion. It's a lot of money that was part of the prisoner swap that we conducted with Iran just a few weeks back. Interesting how quickly this has come back into the news. We've had a series of Republican lawmakers tell us on the air that money needs to be refrozen. It's hard to tell exactly what form that would take, but the administration has been clear. Anthony Blinken talked about it a short time ago. Not a dollar has been spent, and it has not moved from that account. Iran, as a matter of fact, just said that there's been no change in access to the funds. Is this a liability for the administration or not?
I think it's splitting hairs a little bit when they say that the money hasn't been touched. Sure, the dollars are there and they're still in the account, but if you were Iran and you knew that you were going to get a giant paycheck and it was coming your way, it's like what every American does or what any person does, right? You go spend the money before you even get it. So I think there was a little bit of, they knew the money was coming. Palestine in particular already had $75 million in food aid that had gone to them. There was a lot of money being funneled in with foreign aid into this region. And, they used the opportunity to spend it the way that they wanted to. So, I do think it'll be splitting hairs a little bit. I do think it's important that, we find ways in which to prevent that money from getting to them and refreezing it. I think Tim Scott, for example, has introduced legislation in the Senate to do something of that degree. But I do think that this will be a diplomatic conversation that'll happen amongst these countries to make sure that we're not unintentionally funding terrorism right through this type of money.
Well, it's interesting because, Tim Scott, boy, he went pretty far with this. He said Joe Biden has blood on his hands. I mean, he essentially blamed the attack on Joe Biden, which, without any real clear evidence of that, seems to be going a bit far. And then there's the matter of Iran, of course, just overall, whether it helped plan, never mind finance this attack. And we found no link there either. Do we not need to be careful with the way we're talking about this?
There used to be this rule when I was working in Congress where you didn't criticize the American president when he was abroad or when you were at war. And I do think that there's restraint that needs to take as far as our domestic politics go when we are attacking ourselves from within, when we need to be showing nothing but strength and unity abroad. And I think that's a message that probably needs to be conveyed to both sides of the aisle during this time, is making sure that, yes, there's going to be lots of opportunities after this conflict is over for us to do hot washes and, commissions and figure out where the intelligence failures were and what the U.S. could do better and all of those types of things. But at this moment, we really need to be focused on our response to the terrorist attacks, how we're supporting Israel, and making sure that our government is functioning in a way that we can actually provide that type of aid.
There's going to be a big debate about supplemental funding at some point once there's a Speaker of the House, and we'll get to that. But I wonder what you make of the approach right now, because they're talking about bundling a lot of stuff together, funding for Israel, funding for Ukraine, funding for Taiwan, and border security funding to either make it impossible for anyone to vote no or somehow mandatory for everyone to vote yes. I'm not sure the psychology here. Is that a good approach when Republicans have clearly an allergy to an omnibus budget bill like this?
I think it's going to be a lot tougher, especially when you throw in border security into this. I think maybe that there could be some horse trading on Ukraine, Israel, disaster aid, that type of thing. But I really, although it seems silly to even have this conversation because the government in theory is going to shut down in a few weeks and we don't even have a Speaker of the House.
That's a very fair point.
So, like step one, fund the government and get through like the next, CR crisis. And then, or really step one, get a Speaker. Step two, get us through the government shutdown. Step three, let's talk about aid packages.
You're very ambitious.
I know.
This is Washington. Well, we spoke to your former boss, Michael McCaul, yesterday, who chairs the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said he was good with that structure. He also said, though, the first order of business would be a resolution on the floor condemning Hamas and supporting Israel. that may seem obvious to some people here, but you get a sense that this would be front-loaded as soon as there is a speaker, no?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's huge urgency here to make sure that, once again, that the United States is showing full support. Our government is funding, and helping the Israelis however we can. And part of the strategy, too, and, McCall probably knows this better than anyone, is it is going to be imperative for us over the next few weeks to make sure that other countries don't jump into this conflict, that this doesn't become an all-out war against Israel. And, I think there was a lot of success today with Jordan releasing the statement that they did. It was very measured, and it obviously indicated that they were not going to jump into the fray. Yeah. There's lots of questions about some of the other countries on Israel's border, but that is priority number one, and part of that deterrence will be a show of strength from the American government that we will support them in this. So, McCall's right as far as front-loading this and making sure that we take care of it quickly, because the next 2 weeks are going to be really important for that effort.
The next 2 weeks, indeed, and that's why there are not now one but two carrier strike groups heading to the Eastern Mediterranean, right? Will we use them?
In theory, and I think that there's a lot of conversations about how exactly we extract hostages if that comes to it.
Yeah.
So again, moving assets to the region is going to be a really important part of that, depending on what type of operation they end up doing.
You tend to think some of this stuff is already happening and we don't know about it. Is that just me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely it is, right?
Yeah, there's, I have a lot of faith in our national security apparatus, the intelligence community. We have a very capable government and, the most capable defense structure in the world, really, the most capable government in the world to take care of this and to do these types of things. So while we talk about things from a political perspective or, in open channels like this, there's so much that's going on behind the scenes that we'll know later.
People have no idea about right
now.
Yeah. It'll all be in the book, as they say. Someday I want to read Lauren Tomlinson's book. We have more with Lauren straight ahead here on Bloomberg Sound On. Let's get you up to date. We'll turn to the speaker's race next. World and national news now with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Well, you've been talking about it. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East, where he has been pledging unwavering U.S. support for Israel during this meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But as Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reports, Blinken also emphasized Israel must follow the rules of war as it fights back against Hamas.
He says how Israel does this matters. And he says we democracies need to make sure we hold ourselves to those standards, not the standards that terrorists hold themselves to.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reporting more than 2,500 people have been killed since the war with Hamas began. That number includes now 27 Americans. President Biden will be putting his focus back on the economy this afternoon as he meets with corporate CEOs. Bloomberg Government's Jack Fitzpatrick with more on the purpose of this gathering.
He will focus on some of the legislative achievements, the infrastructure bill, that kind of thing, and how they're implementing them with some high-profile people from IBM, a former American Express chair, a number of large companies, and try to turn that towards how they're implementing the agenda with some of the major bills that he got through Congress.
Bloomberg Government's Jack Fitzpatrick in Washington. The White House meeting is set for 4:30 this afternoon, Wall Street time. Still some struggles on the labor front. Negotiations have been suspended between the Hollywood actors and studios. The industry says a viewership bonus that the Actors Union wants would cost more than $800 million a year. The actors say that's an exaggeration of about 60%. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all in the red. Right now, the S&P is down 33 points at 43.43. That is a drop of 0.8%. Stocks are retreating. Treasury yields are climbing as the latest reading on consumer prices bolsters speculation that the Fed is nowhere near declaring victory over inflation, with bets on another rate increase back to coin flip territory. The Dow down 258, drop there of 0.8%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 96, a decline of 0.7%. The NASDAQ 100 Index down 71, down 0.5. And the Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares hit particularly hard today. That index is now lower by 2.3%. 10-year yield 4.70%, with the 2-year right now 5.05%. Spot gold down $4.50 the ounce to $18.70, down by about 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude, $82.62 a barrel, down now by 1%. A measure of household costs rose at a brisk pace in September. And with more on that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Core consumer prices increased 0.3% last month, matching August. The inflation data underscore the Federal Reserve's resolve to maintain high interest rates. The data also show wages are no longer keeping up with inflation. Inflation-adjusted earnings dropped for a second month. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Next up for Wall Street, bank earnings. The biggest U.S. banks are poised to write off more bad loans than they have since the early days of the pandemic. Shares of J.P. Morgan Chase, which reports tomorrow, down 0.4%. Also tomorrow, Citigroup down now by 0.8%. Wells Fargo down by 0.4%. And of course, complete coverage of those bank earnings right here on Bloomberg Radio as we get the numbers. Again, recapping here, the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all lower. S&P down 34, down by about 0.8%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
They came together for about 2.5 minutes today in the U.S. House, dropped the gavel, they're done. No speaker yet, no word on a vote either, as we consider the future here of Steve Scalise, the nominee, we're told, for speaker. Just ask Matt Gaetz.
I'm excited for him. Can't wait to go vote for Steve Scalise.
Absolutely.
Long live Speaker Scalise.
Do you think he has the votes on the floor? He was divided vote in there.
I sure hope so. We'll see some democracy in action.
Democracy in action. Long live Speaker Scalise. Lauren Tomlinson, Republican strategist, with us here at the table in Washington. What do you make of this? We left today, apparently, I don't know if we're done yet, they could come back together, but no vote. While around this time yesterday, it seemed like the whole thing was clicking. Jim Jordan stands down, he's going to nominate Steve Scalise, cats and dogs living together, and we find out that Steve Scalise is still like 100 votes short. How long is this going to go on for?
I don't know, but they need to figure it out as quickly as possible, given everything that we've been talking about today. I still think that this is a long play for McCarthy to show that no other candidate can actually reach a consensus vote, and that he can step in and be the Paul Ryan savior, even though he was the one that was just outed, and then somehow convince people that it's in our best interest to get rid of the motion to vacate agreement that he negotiated in the first place to get into the speakership.
So pay no attention to what's happening here. Pay attention to the man behind the curtain, who is Kevin McCarthy.
This is just my thoughts. So,
that's why
this
you're
is
here.
as I'll say, this is what I'm
You're
thinking.
not the first to suggest this, though. This is not a crazy thought in Washington.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot more sense. And also, I think it's probably an optimistic view of what looks like a lot of chaos right now.
Mm-hmm.
But, the fact that it wasn't Jim Jordan, I think actually speaks louder than anything that, the Freedom Caucus couldn't put up what they were viewing as like their Trump-endorsed candidate, and that, he was the one that could rally the caucus around, some sort of conservative vision. I think that is actually a greater takeaway, that the person that garnered the most votes was Steve Scalise, who's, a McCarthy leadership aide. He's been, running the House Republican conference for a while now. So I do think there was a little bit of reading in the tea leaves there that there might be more support for someone who's a little bit more mainstream than originally thought.
You started your career as a Republican staffer in the U.S. House. What are you hearing from people then? Is it still chaos? Because any lawmaker I hear from on or off the record has no idea when this will be resolved. There's no path. It's not days, it's weeks.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, I just hear nervous. I think would be like the, you know, everyone's like, okay, we'll figure this out because, you know, we need to. But everyone's just nervous because it's so unknown. So that's what I hear the most. But again, you know, we talk about these timelines. The CR is expiring at the end of this month. That is a huge time, like, you know, huge deadline that we need to get a speaker in place before that happens because we
17th.
have to keep the government open. So, you know, I think that's also like there's a ticking time bomb at the end of this where the longer this goes on, the more that people need to coalesce around someone and quickly because this isn't something that can go on indefinitely, not even to mention what we were talking about with Israel and, you know, what is required of the United States government right now.
Jim Jordan was endorsed by Donald Trump. Some have gone out of their way to say Trump loses again. And you wonder if that actually held Jordan back in maybe counting some extra votes here. But Donald Trump is weighing in on Israel now. Pretty hard to hide from the comments. He essentially insulted Benjamin Netanyahu for not taking part in the U.S. mission to kill Soleimani, and then referred to Hamas as being very smart. This was in a speech in Florida last night, West Palm. Listen to Donald Trump, and we'll have Lauren.
I'll never forget that Bibi Netanyahu let us down. That was a very terrible thing. I will say that. And so when I see sometimes the intelligence, you talk about the intelligence, or you talk about some of the things that went wrong over the last week, they've got to straighten it out because they're fighting potentially a very big force. They're fighting potentially Iran, and when they have people saying the wrong things, everything they say is being digested by these people because they're vicious and they're smart, and boy are they vicious because nobody's ever seen the kind of sight that we've seen. Nobody's ever seen it, but they cannot play games. So we were disappointed by that, very disappointed, but we did the job ourselves, and it was absolute precision, magnificent, beautiful job. And then Bibi tried to take credit for it. That wasn't good. That didn't make me feel too good, but that's all right.
I don't know what kind of a night he was having. I'd have to bleep other cuts if I played them for you, the way he described the state of the U.S. Capitol right now. Does this matter when it comes to the MAGA base, and how much of the Republican Party is he speaking for?
I hope none. You know, I think that it's crazy that he makes these comments. And one, like, you know, you do have to, there's a question of how much of that he should have actually been talking about when he's talking about Soleimani raid, and his recounting of facts is not what we would consider true in that regard as far as Israeli involvement. But on a broader point, you know, he has this horrible tendency to praise those that are, you know, he views as quote unquote strong. And, you know, these are dictators that he's praising, and these are terrorist organizations that he is praising. And I think that that sends the wrong signal about American leadership in the world and the values that we uphold. And I would, if I was a Republican member, take note of this and say, I'm not going to support these comments. I need to differentiate myself. And, you know, it was very quick that DeSantis also called these comments.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to.
He went straight out on Twitter/X, whatever it's called, and condemned these remarks. And I think that's probably the right tack that a lot of Republicans are going to have to take. I mean, you mentioned the speaker's race, and if that is a referendum on Trump, I mean, it's important to note that it was a secret ballot.
Yeah. Right.
And so I think that had a lot to do with it as well. So, you know, there is, I think, a recognition that you can't stand behind all of Trump's comments, especially when it comes to these types of instances. His relationship with the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, is he doesn't like him from a personal standpoint.
Yes.
So this
he
has
acknowledged Joe Biden's victory.
Yes, exactly. It goes back to the 2020 election. And that, to me, the fact that you can't say that what Hamas is doing is atrocious and that we should not stand for it and have that mixed up in your personal views of a leader is what's the problem.
The tweet from Ron DeSantis, President Trump, he goes on to point out here, clearly pointing out how incompetent the Biden administration is. He says it is absurd that anyone, much less someone running for president, would choose now to attack our friend and ally, Israel. Lauren Tomlinson, great conversation and great to see you. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. New York City is home to more securities industry workers than at any point in more than 20 years, but a top state official says job cuts triggered by a banking sector slump could put more of them at risk. And with more on the story, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
Charlie, according to a report from New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli, the city's securities industry accounted for 195,100 jobs on average for the first 8 months of 2023. He attributes the strength to a hiring surge in response to record profits in 2021. But earnings and revenue have softened in part because rising interest rates have weighed on deal volume. That has prompted New York-based financial giants, including Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs Group, to thin their ranks. DiNapoli says these are volatile times in America and globally, and Wall Street's relatively stable profits and employment levels could change quickly. Charlie?
And that's Steve Rappaport reporting. He mentioned Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs. Citigroup, which reports earnings tomorrow, shares now lower by 0.6%. Morgan Stanley shares, they are down by 1.6%, and Goldman Sachs shares right now are lower by 1.3%. Walgreens Boots Alliance has announced a $1 billion cost-cutting program as it prepares to reset its growth strategy under a new CEO. And Delta Airlines this morning reported reported quarterly earnings that beat analyst estimates, but the carrier cut the high end of its outlook for 2023 profit because of rising fuel prices and larger than expected aircraft maintenance costs. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We are live from Washington, where we'll add Kaylee Lyons to the conversation coming up in just 5 minutes. First, we bring you up to date on world and national news. For that, we turn to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. NATO is condemning Hamas attacks on civilians and calling for the immediate release of all hostages, with Israel's war against Gaza's militant rulers now on its 7th day. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Hamas must be destroyed.
President Biden was absolutely correct in calling this sheer evil. Hamas is ISIS, and just as ISIS was crushed, so too will Hamas be crushed.
Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke alongside Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is calling on Israel to safeguard civilians as it retaliates against Hamas. Bloomberg's Bill Ferries with more.
I think Secretary Blinken is there really to be a very public show of force there for the Israeli government. And to hear, I think, firsthand from the top government officials, from this new war cabinet that's been created in Israel, and from Israeli military officials about what they need at this point.
Again, Bloomberg's Bill Ferries. Well, former President Trump's latest comments about the Israel-Hamas war are facing some bipartisan blowback. We get that story from Bloomberg's Nathan Hager.
At a rally last night in West Palm Beach, Florida, the former president said Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu let him down for not going along with the drone strike that killed an Iranian general in 2020. And he said this about Iran-backed militants in Lebanon.
You know, Hezbollah is very smart. They're all very smart. The press doesn't like when they say it.
Trump's GOP rival Ron DeSantis went on X to call Trump's remarks absurd from anyone, much less someone running for president. A White House spokesman called the statements, quote, dangerous and unhinged. A Trump campaign spokesman says when it comes to the former president's remarks, smart does not equal good. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe.
All right, Nancy, I appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we keep an eye on what's happening in Israel with some very tough news, some very difficult images to see as we all wake up to this doom scroll each morning. And, of course, talking about some very difficult policy matters with lawmakers here every day. And as we track the Secretary of State's visit now to Tel Aviv, I think it's important for everyone to hear an encounter that he had at a donation site. He met a woman who survived the attack on a music festival last weekend, by the attack by Hamas. Clearly moved. It was a very emotional encounter and something you won't hear anywhere else today. This is the secretary with this woman as they met today in Tel Aviv.
Yes, we lost a lot of our friends, close friends, lots of family members. There are a lot of people that we know that are kidnapped and now in Gaza. Yeah, we went through horror, really. I'm 24, and I never imagined something like this would happen ever in a dance and a music festival. We celebrated love, and we danced, and it was amazing. And then the rockets started and gunshots everywhere. We managed to escape, but there were a lot of friends that didn't, and there are a lot of friends that are kept captive now in Gaza. And we were saved by miracle, but there are friends that we love that aren't. Thank you for being here. It's really important. And if there's any way to help, like, first priority are our friends and family that are now in Gaza. We're strong here, we're powerful here, in this place, now in Tel Aviv and everywhere. Thank you very much.
We're thinking of them and trying to do everything we can.
I know.
We want to bring them home.
Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pretty tough to listen to and watch. These are real people we're talking about. Hour 2 of Sound On starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
The Biden administration says we're making good on a long-held promise. Ballooning budget deficits in Washington. We're in a bizarro political world here.
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
Most people, including most Republicans in Congress, understand that we need to get aid to Ukraine.
Who's going to take us in a rational way into the future and lead our country?
This has really become kind of a new frontier in American politics, is this battle between red states and blue cities.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The U.S. offers charter flights out of Israel. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On. As the administration moves to help people leave the country who are looking for a way out, and we're joined ahead by Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, who is helping to lead the push to get New Yorkers out of country. The Republican will also give us an update on the fight for Speaker, which continues here. We'll discuss that later with Bloomberg Politics reporter Mike Dorning. And data today on inflation. We'll be joined from New York by Bloomberg Economics editor Michael McKee. We've got news as well today on the auto strikes in Detroit, which are expanding. And we'll have all of that for you over the course of Hour 2 here on Sound On. Live from Washington, thanks for joining us. Kaylee Lines is here, just back from Capitol Hill, and it's great to see you. As always, Kaylee, you were there. You were as close to the sun as you can get today, and we didn't learn anything really about the race for Speaker. The session, I think, on the floor lasted about 2.5 minutes, and I guess the Republican conference meeting behind closed doors didn't last a lot longer.
Well, we're still hearing from members who are coming out of the meeting. It's unclear, really, Joe, to your point, how much progress they're actually making in there. It seems like it's generically an airing of grievances about Steve Scalise. Steve Scalise trying to allay some concerns as he tries to get the 217 votes he needs to be Speaker. And yet I caught up with a number of members outside of the room who said they are still not with Scalise. Carlos Jimenez, for example, is still McCarthy only. Yeah. There's others like Congressman Miller who are still no's on Scalise, and some who are saying, like Congressman Self, they're going to vote Jordan, even though Jordan said he would give the nominating speech for Scalise. It just feels like it's still math that isn't adding up.
My God. I'm glad you came back because I'll tell you what, Congresswoman Malliotakis is still there. Nicole Malliotakis of New York, of course, back with us on Bloomberg and joining us from Capitol Hill. Congresswoman, it's great to see you. I want to ask you about your efforts here involving Israel. But with regard to the fight for Speaker, do you have a popsicle headache yet?
Look, it's very frustrating to me because I just want to move forward, elect a speaker, and get back to work. There's just too many things going on in this place. We have government funding that's going to run out in roughly a month, and we need to pass the remaining 8 of the 12 appropriation bills and send them to the Senate so we could begin these negotiations and try to get some wins for the American people who want to see wasteful, excessive spending cut. They want to see a secure border. And so I was with McCarthy all the way. I mean, McCarthy was a great speaker. What happened to him was a travesty, and it was an injustice. But he's no longer running, and I supported Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan did not come out ahead of Steve Scalise. Steve Scalise won yesterday's vote. And as was reported, Jim Jordan supporting Steve Scalise. So I'm with Steve Scalise now. He's a good person. He's an honorable person. He will make a good speaker. The bottom line is we just need to get in that room, elect a speaker, and move forward. There's just too many things happening in the world, too many threats here at home. We need to get the job done and start protecting the American people.
Well, Congresswoman, you say you think he is a good and honorable person, but does that make him the person within the Republican conference who can get 217 votes? It just seems like it's very difficult for him at this moment.
Yeah, look, it seems that I don't know that anyone can get 217 votes. That's the problem. I mean, there's always seems to be a small faction who's opposed to anybody that we put up. And it's not always the same 8 people, right? So we had Matt Gaetz and his crew work with the Democrats to remove Kevin McCarthy, who was supported by 97% of our conference. And now we have a different 10 to 20 people who are opposed to Steve Scalise at this time. So it is challenging and it is frustrating for people like me who just want to move forward. I supported all 3 of those individuals. I'm sure there's many other people within the conference who can do the job. But we just need to be united and understand that our fight should be with the Senate, with the White House, for the conservative policies that the American people want, and that in this time when there's so many global pressing issues that could easily become domestic issues, and they are in many ways, right? Because we have Americans who are in Israel that we're trying to get evacuated. We have some that have sadly already been killed by Hamas. This is exactly what we should be focused on today, is how do we support our ally, Israel? How do we get those Americans home, which is, I've been pushing the State Department, and finally we've got some good news today. But this is what we should be doing, not sitting in a room, airing grievances.
Yeah, it's got to be tedious. I just wonder, to the extent that you engage with your colleagues, Congresswoman, what do you tell your fellow Republicans who disagree when you're behind closed doors in a meeting like that today? Or is that not the tenor of these gatherings?
Look, I think everyone gets an opportunity to say how they feel, where their support is, what their concerns are, what needs to be changed, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, we still need to, if it's not going to be Steve, we need to figure out who it is. But somebody has to get the 217 that is needed so we can proceed with our legislative business. It's only going to make things worse if we don't get to pass the appropriation bills that need to be passed and send them over to the Senate now. That's delaying a process. And then they're going to be all upset in a month when we get stuff back from the Senate that we're unhappy with, and there's no time to negotiate. So, I mean, we just need to get back in there, pass those remaining bills out, send support for Israel, and get on with the legislative business. Like I said, look, I can support multiple candidates. I've laid out 3 for you that I thought could be good speakers. But at the end of the day, it's not just me, right? You have 221 people in a room. Everybody's got a different opinion. And that's just, leading to the frustration that we're seeing among members like myself and others.
Well, as you talk about the difficulty of getting 217 Republicans to back any one individual Congresswoman, I wonder where you think the Democrats are in this. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted or posted on X earlier today. I will read you the quote. Given that the vote for Speaker was supposed to be yesterday, it seems much more realistic for 5 Republican members in Biden districts to vote Jeffries than it is for Mr. David Duke without the baggage. She says that in quotes, referring here to Steve Scalise, to flip 107 people in overtime. Congresswoman, what is your response to that?
But the Democrats are complicit in what occurred with the removal of Speaker McCarthy. Every single Democrat voted with the right fringe of our party to remove a speaker that 97% of our conference supported. So they are complicit. They are part of the reason why we're in this situation without a speaker to begin with. They said they didn't want to be involved in the Republican fracture. Well, then they should have all voted present, and then this would have never happened. If they just voted present and stayed out of it, this would have never happened. But they chose to insert themselves, and they voted with Matt Gaetz, who is among the most right-wing member of our conference, who majority of our conference wishes he wasn't part of our conference, to remove a speaker that was doing a good job. And why? Because he averted a shutdown, because he prevented a debt default, and because he averted a shutdown. He was removed from power because he did the right thing on behalf of the American people. The Democrats should have done the right thing and recognized that, this is something that should be applauded, not punished.
That's why a lot of people are saying, Congresswoman, I'm sure you hear it if I'm hearing it, that Kevin McCarthy is still a viable candidate and could be Speaker again. Is that something that you would allow for?
I'd be all for it. I think Kevin was a great speaker. He did a good job. We passed a lot of our priorities out of the House. People may be upset that the border is not secure. It's not because of House Republicans. We passed that bill. It's because of Chuck Schumer. They are refusing to do their job. They don't want to pass our bill, and they don't want to pass their own bill so we can reconcile the differences. People are upset about energy costs. It's not because of House Republicans. We passed our energy priority to increase domestic production to lower the cost of gas and energy costs across America. Senator Schumer's been sitting on it, he refuses to address it. So the people have to recognize that that we are only 1/3 of the federal government, and that we have to work with the Senate and the White House. And you know, we're not going to always get what we want, but we were able to get some good things. I thought, in particular, capping spending, making sure we had more checks and balances for the president to be able to spend money without congressional support. You know, there's certain things that we were able to negotiate in that debt limit. I had faith that Speaker McCarthy was in the room negotiating the best we could get for the American people from the conservative perspective. Unfortunately, there's some in our conference that don't understand give and take, compromise, negotiation. Everybody's got to give a little to get some, and that's really why we're in the situation we're in today, is because people want to be stubborn and want to be holdouts instead of seeing the bigger picture here, that we need. It's good for the party, it's good for the Congress, the institution, and it's good for the country if we go in and just elect a speaker and move forward with business and recognize the fight is not with each other, it is with the Senate and it is with the White House.
Okay, well, Congresswoman, let's talk about the White House, because we just heard from the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre that President Biden is going to be releasing a supplemental request next week. And we have had reports in recent days that that supplemental request may include funding for Israel, along with funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, possibly border measures as well. There's been a lot of talk now about the idea of Ukraine funding and funding for Israel being tied together. Is that appropriate in your mind?
I think these are separate issues that should be taken up separately. There's already been, $125 billion sent to Ukraine. People rightfully want to know what's been done with that money. What are the goals should we give more money? What will it be used for? They want to see metrics. They want to see accountability. Israel is imminent right now that we get something to support them, because we haven't done any package to support Israel yet. Certainly they need more equipment. They need Iron Dome interceptors. They need precision missiles. So we need to do that, and that is important. With the border, to ask us for more money to just continue paperwork instead of actually securing the border, that should be a discussion, because we've passed a Border Security Act that would reinstate many of the policies of the previous administration that was stemming the flow at the border, was making sure we knew who was coming in and out of our country, and was doing it responsibly. We need to be very concerned right now that we have an open border. And the fact that the Senate and some of the Democrats, and well, actually all the Democrats from the House, are not taking that seriously is a problem. When we passed the Border Security Act, we're simply saying, look, people should remain in the next safe country, not come to the United States. That's what created this influx that we're seeing. We also don't want people to be just released into the interior without knowing where they're going or where they'll be, or if they're going to return for their court dates. We need to add immigration judges to hear these cases more swiftly, determine who's a legitimate asylum seeker from who is not. And we need to put in place what Customs and Border Protection have been asking us for: technology, training, equipment. They've been asking us for certain things, and unfortunately, I think I got disconnected here. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where, we need to move forward and pass the border security. Look, just to make it clear for people, 1.7 million individuals have entered into our border, okay? And they are unaccounted for. These are undetected individuals. It's what Customs and Border Protection have estimated. This is in addition to the 5-6 million crossings that we've seen. 1.7 million individuals. We don't know who they are, where they are, what their intentions are. This should be very concerning, considering what is happening in Israel right now.
All right, if you can still hear me, Congresswoman,
I'm
not sure that she
difficulty.
can. Let's see if we can figure that out. This is
the beauty of live broadcasting.
Absolutely.
Joe.
That's actually happened to me on the air before. Congresswoman, I apologize.
Right,
That's happened to me as well on the air. It's a horrifying feeling. I just want to better understand, though, your answer to Kaylee's question. Would that bog down, then, a supplemental request for Israeli funding? Is that why you want to see that handled as a separate matter?
If you're going to bring the border into this and you're going to bring Ukraine into this, there's a lot of questions that members have. Particularly, we want to see real border security. and we want to see some of the policies that we've passed in our Border Security Act enacted. So yeah, that could slow down support. And it's probably why the administration wants to insert it in there, because they're trying to just get what they want without having to answer questions from members of Congress. But we have checks and balances. We have oversight. We have to hold this administration accountable for what they are and are not doing. And so we want to make sure that if there's going to be anything related to the border, that we're going to see serious border security to stop this unsafe and unsustainable flow that is affecting the entire nation, and my mayor is saying is going to bankrupt and destroy New York City.
I've got one more for you, Congresswoman. I know this is difficult for you. If you're with us on YouTube, you can see why, but you can drop your earpiece after I ask this question. And it has to do with your drive to get flights out of Israel. If we can get back to where we started here, the administration today, the State Department is talking about getting chartered flights together, but you led a letter that was signed on by more than 140 lawmakers to try to get New Yorkers and others out of Israel who need access to that transportation. Where does that stand?
Yeah, so, well, it seems like the State Department has been moving now, and that this could begin as early as tomorrow. What we've basically said, and it's a shame that we're already on 5 days. Other countries, Germany, Poland, Mexico, Canada, they've been there. They've been evacuating citizens either via military aircraft or chartered commercial planes. We believe now that we finally are hearing that the State Department is going to start evacuating individuals via chartered planes as early as tomorrow. So we're waiting for that evacuation plan. I think for those who have relatives, loved ones, American citizens who are in Israel who are trying to leave, I think the most important thing they could do right now is make sure they're registered with the State Department. They could do it online. I've posted this information on my Facebook page. People can get it off of there. And you should call your member of Congress. I think that's really important, because my office has been working directly with constituents to try to get them on charter flights through another means, without the help, unfortunately, of the State Department, but through a Congressman, Corey Mills, who's on the ground right now. And we've been able to get either people to Jordan or now we're working to try to get people to Cyprus. So what I'll say is it is important that you let your Congress member know if you are in Israel or you have a loved one, an American citizen is in Israel, so that way they can help track and expedite the situation and get them on the right path.
It's a really important message. I'm glad you could join us, Congresswoman. Thank you for spending some time with us today from Capitol Hill on what, of course, we know is a very busy day. Nicole Malliotakis, Republican from New York, clearly going through a lot here, Kaylee, and frustrated at the process involving the Speaker or lack thereof.
Yeah, lack thereof being the state of play at the moment, Joe, and it's very unclear at this time how long we're going to stay that way, as it feels like not a lot of progress has been made. And, something that members did tell me has been buzzing about, Byron Donald said a number of members have brought this up, even though he doesn't necessarily agree with it, is empowering Patrick McHenry, the Speaker pro tem, to do more in the interim.
We've been talking about that since the beginning. We may start talking about that a lot more again, as yesterday's breakthrough doesn't feel like so much of a breakthrough at this point. Pretty interesting, though, Kaylee. She said she was still open to a Speaker, Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah. We'll see if that actually has to become a reality, potentially. Someone's got to get the votes, right?
Find us on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Global News if you want to see Patrick McHenry really slam that gavel. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. It's the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. S&P 500 index now down 1%, halting a 4-day advance. We've got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ trading at or near session lows as the selling intensifies on this Thursday. Right now, the Dow is up 33,507, down 297 points. That represents a drop right now of 0.9%. S&P 500 index down 44, a decline, as I mentioned, of 1%. NASDAQ down 142, a drop of 1% as well. Small cap shares are being hit particularly hard today. The Russell 2000 index now down by 2.6%. 10-year yield 4.70% with a 2-year 5.04%. Spot gold 1870 the ounce, down by about 0.2%. And West Texas intermediate crude oil down 1%, 82.64 barrels. Stocks retreated, treasury yields climbed as the latest reading on consumer prices bolstered speculation that the Fed is nowhere near declaring victory over inflation. New York Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis just wrapping up a wide-ranging interview right here on Sound On, and she had this update on getting Americans out of Israel.
We've been able to get either people to Jordan or now we're working to try to get people to Cyprus. So what I'll say is it is important that you let your Congress member know if you are in Israel or you have a loved one, an American citizen is in Israel, so that way they can help track and expedite the situation and get them on the right path.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Sound On podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Stocks lower again, recapping. S&P down 43, a drop right now of 1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Just another day in Crazy Town as we try to figure out who might be the next Speaker of the House, and somehow it's getting harder with time. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm sorry to be silly, but I don't know what else to say here. We show up every day talking about this, and it seems like it's getting dumber by the minute.
Certainly not paradise.
Not paradise. And if you're Steve Scalise, you thought you might be whipping votes after this breakthrough yesterday that declared him the nominee.
Yeah.
But he seems further away than he was 24 hours ago. By the way, not all those votes were real. I guess there were U.S. territories voting.
Right.
So he actually needs more votes than we thought he did at this time yesterday.
Well over 100
is
what he needs to get in his corner that were not in his corner yesterday. Now, there are some members like Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, who we were just speaking with, who were for Jim Jordan, who are now for Scalise.
Following him.
Because Jim Jordan is now for Steve Scalise. But there's plenty of others who are just simply digging in their heels even further as time goes on, who seem to be in the kind of never Scalise camp. And it's just a question of, can Scalise make any concessions, do anything to change their minds, or are we going to have to figure out another way to make this math work?
We, of course, talked last evening on Balance of Power with Brian Stile, the Republican from Wisconsin. I don't know if I moderate, but establishment Republican, I guess is the word that I'm looking for. And he's still sore about the folks who fired Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah.
Not to mention the holdouts who are part of this now. Here's what he said.
Well, I'm optimistic that we don't need to go through a process of deal making. I think that's an unproductive process. But here's the challenge. We have a group of members that are viewing this as an opportunity to leverage for things other than pulling us together in a form of unity to really push back against the real overreaches of the Biden administration.
So Nicole Malliotakis just told us that she doesn't think anybody can get to 217.
Yeah.
So what are we doing here?
I don't know.
So there'll have to be a deal at some point that involves Democrats, and that'll be a whole new reason to fire, I guess, whoever's Speaker.
Yes. I'm just going to start saying everything with an implied question mark at the end.
Fine,
Joe. I have no
I'll
answers
keep talking.
here.
By the way, and you were the one who was on Capitol Hill earlier today.
Didn't bring me much further clarity.
Mike Dorning is just looking at us from across the table, wondering if we're ever going to get anywhere, and I'm not sure we are today. Bloomberg politics reporter, you're no closer to the end game here than we are you?
No, and it does, as you're saying, at the moment, I mean, if you just pull out to 30,000 feet, what's going on is there were these rifts in the Republican Party that toppled Kevin McCarthy. Mm-hmm. And what's happened is instead of healing or closing any of those rifts, They've only deepened, and there's more fractures that are appearing. So basically, the Republican Party over the last 9 days in the House has pulled farther apart instead of coming together. And we're not at the point yet where they're coming together.
Well, it raises the question then of the other composition of the House of Representatives, the 221 Republicans aside. There's a bunch of Democrats who have power here. Our thinking is that they're going to just unanimously vote for Hakeem Jeffries, who is their leader. You had AOC posting on social media earlier today that maybe just 5 moderate Republicans who are in districts Biden won should just hop on over and vote for Hakeem Jeffries, get the House as Speaker. I think we all know that's probably pretty unlikely to happen. Yeah. But is there a role for Democrats to flip here? How long does this have to go on before that becomes more of a real scenario?
It has to go on considerably longer before there's some middle road. It's a possible outcome. I wouldn't say it's a likely outcome at this point. But even if it is the outcome, I think there has to be a few more shots at the Republicans sort of putting a Republican House in order before we enter some, Italian, Israeli, Spanish-style coalition government in the U.S. House of Representatives, where you have, different splinter parties from the two main American parties assembling into some temporary, very unstable, probably coalition.
A lot of folks still think the long game is Kevin McCarthy, which I get a kick out of because
it's certainly possible. And, I think a lot of people, including maybe now today some of Scalise's aides, think that that's what he's doing. He's letting them fail at every opportunity and then maybe come back to him. I don't know how likely that is, but it's at least a scenario some people
talk about. Did you see the comments that he made, Kaylee? He told reporters, it's possible Scalise becomes Speaker, but it's a big hill, he added.
Yes.
Not exactly an endorsement.
And it doesn't seem like he's, trying to give him a boost, a push up that hill.
That was a kind of a well-timed if you're against Scalise, but not well-timed if you're for Scalise moment for McCarthy to weigh in. And then just shortly afterwards, things started to percolate about President Trump weighing in, which probably didn't help him much either.
Yeah, the former President Trump on a different radio network speaking about his concerns around Steve Scalise's cancer. And that's something that Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has also said that she won't support Steve Scalise on the floor.
Everyone's very concerned about his well-being now.
Which, on the one hand, maybe it's a convenient excuse for someone to say, I'm not voting for him for this reason. But that's also a valid concern, right? I mean, he is fighting blood cancer as we speak.
It is a valid concern, and it's particularly a concern that President Trump is marketing in his presidential campaign, that, you have to look at the well-being of older leaders in America. So, it certainly fits with Trump's narrative for the presidential election. And it is a concern a lot of people have about Biden, McConnell, and now maybe the Speaker of the House.
Donald Trump had a lot of things to say last night down in Florida. I can't even play half of it on the air with some of the language that he was using. I'm not sure what you made of his address. He said, Bibi Netanyahu let us down. I could play you the cut. This has had to do with the killing of Soleimani. Then he went on to say that Hamas was very smart. I asked a Republican strategist in that chair last hour if that speaks for the Republican Party. She said adamantly not. But that certainly reflects, I'm guessing, the feeling of some of the folks who were laughing and clapping in that crowd.
Yeah, that is, well, we'll just say that it's a very impolitic thing to say.
My God, yeah.
I'm not quite sure what the sort of rational goal in saying something like that is, except just to be riffing on whatever occurs in your head. There's just no percentage for an American politician to be gained by criticizing the leader of a country who's been the victim of an aggression at this point, who's an ally, and just, common sense, you don't sort of we're not big on victim blaming in America. So I don't know where he was coming from. I certainly think that it's harmful to Trump, but I don't know how harmful, because his base of support is very strong, and it seems like it takes a lot to even take a chink out of that.
But of course, it kind of speaks to the idea that there is, at this moment, a lot of bipartisanship when it comes to the issue of Israel, what they're dealing with, the need to provide them support and aid that Israel needs. And yet we know that a lot of that, at least on the congressional end, whatever needs approval, isn't going to be done right now until there's a Speaker of the House, which maybe raises the specter perhaps more of the idea that could the Speaker pro tem, Patrick McHenry, actually perhaps get some more power in the interim until
it is something that some members of the Republican caucus have been raising, the idea of at least giving McHenry some extra powers so that he could get through some legislation that had, broad support in the House. They haven't gotten there yet, and I would imagine that the Scalise camp really wouldn't want that to happen right now. They'd rather finish this out, and then if he drops out, then the next person won't want that to happen because they'll want the choice to be either you support Scalise's campaign or we're in disarray, or maybe if Jordan takes over next, then Jim Jordan will be, we either want you to be supporting Jim Jordan or we're in disarray. So while that seems on the outside like a kind of a nice, good government approach, it would probably take a while before you could get, enough support for that to happen, just for crass personal political reasons. And in Washington, sometimes those are a factor.
That's for sure. Well, we still don't know when we're going to get to a vote. We'll certainly let you know when that happens. And no, this is not normal. Mike Dorning, great to see you. Thank us, as always, for the
Thanks for inviting me.
With us here on Sound On. Yes, indeed. Kaylee Lyons and I have a little bit more to do here. We're going to talk coming up about the inflation data out this morning, and we'll look at the latest from the UAW, remembering there's an historic auto strike that continues against the backdrop of all of these stories. Let's bring you up to date now, world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on a diplomacy visit to the Middle East. He's been in Israel, where he assured Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the U.S. fully supports Israel.
We encountered a nation knit together by grief, but also a nation united in resolve. The United States shares that resolve. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Israel.
Blinken is also making stops in other countries in hopes of mitigating any escalation. Nick Wadhams is Bloomberg's national security team leader.
He's going to 4 more countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And obviously all 4 of those countries have different levels of influence on Hamas and Iran. What he's really trying to show there is that the U.S. wants to prevent this from becoming a wider war.
Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams speaking earlier on Bloomberg Sound On. There have been questions about $6 billion in oil revenue that Iran was allowed to access under a recent prisoner exchange. A person familiar with the situation now says the U.S. and Qatar have reached an informal understanding that the money will remain frozen while the U.S. looks into Tehran's potential involvement in last week's Hamas attack against Israel. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A bounce off the bottom, but the S&P 500 index, the Dow, and NASDAQ all lower across the board. Russell 2000 right now, the index of small cap shares down by 2.5%. S&P 500 is holding a 4-day advance down 36, a drop of 0.8%. Stocks fell, Treasury yields rose as data bolstered speculation the Fed is nowhere near declaring victory over inflation, with bets on another hike. Back to coin flip territory. We've got more on that issue coming up in just a moment with our Michael McKee. 10-year yield 4.70%, with the 2-year right now 5.05%. Spot gold down $4 the ounce to $18.70, a decline there of 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude now at $83.31 a barrel. WTI down by about 0.2%. Ford has become the latest strike target for the UAW after members walked out of its largest plant, a highly profitable pickup factory in Kentucky. And weekly jobless claims do remain stable, holding at a historically low 209,000. With that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Bloomberg Economics says the strike against the big three automakers poses a risk to America's labor market. It sees the effects intensifying the longer the strike drags on. Though not all auto plants are affected, automakers have furloughed some non-striking workers. Allied industries could also feel the impact. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And, of course, more on the strikes and the economy coming up right here on Sound On. Ford shares, they're lower now by 2%. General Motors down 2.5%. Stellantis down by 2.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Keely Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
One story we've not even touched yet today is that of the economy and the fight against inflation. It's CPI day. In a normal world, that would probably have been our lead story, which gives you a sense of the period of time that we're in here, covering the speaker's battle, this war in Israel and beyond. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lines. Of course, you had your eyes on the data this morning. That's what we do around here. And boy, the news is not great for this White House. As you read on the terminal, the Fed is nowhere near declaring victory over inflation. Yet another reminder today.
Yeah, it's not good news for the Fed either. Like, let's be very clear, because the numbers came in hotter than expected. This is the second month in a row, and it follows PPI yesterday, which also came in a little hotter than expected. It's not the trajectory you would like to see. The numbers are no longer huge like they once were. We're talking 3.7% on headline year-over-year inflation, but still 2%. 2% is where they're trying to go.
Ways off.
We are still not there.
And you've got a White House here and a president running for re-election who desperately wants to say that we won the war on inflation.
Absolutely.
Man, we are not there.
Well, especially when you consider a lot of what is factoring into this is higher energy prices.
Sure.
And that's what's visible to a lot of American voters, how much they're paying at the gas pump.
Do you have that statement from the White House on that today?
I bet I
saw that.
Pull it up real quick.
Yeah, I don't mean to put you on the spot there, but the idea that somehow the core is the matter here. I think real people still pay for food and energy. Michael McKee can help us get to that.
Yeah.
Bloomberg Economics editor. You still buy gas and food, right, Michael?
I live in New York City, so I don't really buy a lot of gas.
So you don't buy gas. All right, I take it back.
But I do buy food. No, I know what you mean. And it is, there's a big difference between Washington and Wall Street on this. For Wall Street, for economists, food and gasoline are very volatile, and they don't really give you a true picture of underlying inflation. But for the average person out in America, and they're the people, the voters that folks in Washington care about, they know that they're paying more money, and so that makes them unhappy, and they tend to blame who's ever in office at the time.
Okay, so that's the way voters feel, Mike, when they're looking at the numbers. How do you think the Federal Reserve is feeling when they look at numbers like this? It's a little hot, just a little, but it is still hot.
It is. I think basically what they're thinking is that they did not expect this to be a linear progression down smoothly, culminating in 2%. If you go back and look at their forecasts that they make every 3 months, the latest one doesn't see a 2% inflation rate until 2026. So this is kind of what they expected to happen. When you get down this low, it gets harder to wring out some of that final inflation, because every month some prices go up, some prices go down. We saw an unexpected rise in airfares, for example, last month. And used car prices went down, but not as much as the wholesale numbers would have suggested. So there's always some quirks in there that make it hard to get down to the 2% level. And they did not expect this to happen very quickly. So I don't think it changes their views a whole lot about what's happening with monetary policy. It wasn't a big surprise to the upside.
So it's not that we're changing our view here on the trajectory of interest rates. Does it make one more likely next month?
Marginally, you could say, but this is going to be one of those cases where it's the overall preponderance of evidence that would sway them one way or another. Not this CPI reading, not the jobs number we got. We still get PCE inflation at the end of the month. Then we get retail sales and personal spending, and that will figure into it too. Bank of America out with a report today that they track spending on their credit cards, and people have not really slowed down. So at this point, the Fed could make an argument either way. Maybe we have to do more because the economy is stronger than we thought, and it is keeping pressure on inflation, not really raising it, but keeping pressure on inflation. And you could also say that, well, we're waiting for the full effects of this to hit. We can see it hitting certain areas, and we can afford to wait and see what happens in another month.
When we talk about what the Fed is looking at, Mike, what about super core? Right, that's the services inflation. You take out a few
You're
metrics.
going super core?
I'm going super core. I want Mike McKee to explain to everybody listening
and
watching Sound On right now, super core inflation.
Yeah, I'm pulling that up right now. Super core is basically the core rate, which is X food and energy. Take food and energy out because, as we said, they're rather volatile. And then you take out housing because housing prices take a long time to change because of the way they put them into the CPI. And we've seen a very, very slow process of prices coming down, and then they went up a little bit this month. So if you want to see what's really just happening in core services, then you would want to take out housing as well as energy and food. And the reason they look at the core services is because most of that is wages. So if wages are still going up and pushing inflation higher, putting pressure on inflation, then they know they have a problem. And Supercore did go up this month by 0.6%. That's the fastest in about 4 months. And so it is not it wasn't a good story there either.
I feel like your band could be named Supercore, Kaylee.
Oh.
Kaylee Lines.
Kaylee's doing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Think about that.
Where do I get tickets?
That's a whole other show.
Michael McKee on the keyboard.
Hey, I've got to ask you in our remaining moment here. That's right, Michael on the keys. About the UAW, you see Ford now being targeted, a surprise walkout by 8,700 workers at this Ford plant in Kentucky. They make the high-priced Super Duty versions of the F-Series pickup trucks.